The first thing Li Wei felt was the cold. It seeped through the thin fabric of his robes, a damp chill that clung to his skin like morning dew on forgotten stone. He opened his eyes to a ceiling of cracked wooden beams, where patches of sky showed through gaps in the tiles like scattered blue eyes. Dust motes danced in shafts of pale sunlight, illuminating a scene of decay that made his modern mind recoil. He pushed himself up from the worn floor, his hands pressing against splintered planks. The hall was vast but empty, its grandeur long faded. Tattered banners hung from pillars carved with cloud motifs, their azure colors bleached to gray. At the far end, a dais held a broken throne, its armrests chipped away by time or violence. The air smelled of mildew, old incense, and something else, the metallic tang of desperation. Memories flooded him, disjointed and strange. Li Wei, a strategist from another world, analyzing war games on glowing screens. Then darkness, a sensation of falling, and now this, a body not his own, memories not his own, a legacy of ruin. The Azure Cloud Sect. His sect. The knowledge settled in his gut like a stone. He inherited this. And with it, he knew, came debt. Footsteps echoed from the entrance, heavy and purposeful. 3 men strode into the hall, their boots kicking up small clouds of dust. They wore practical tunics of dark cloth, leather armor over their chests, and expressions of bored impatience. The lead man had a scar across his cheek that pulled his lip into a permanent sneer. He carried a scroll case in one hand, tapping it against his palm. Li Wei, the scarred man said, his voice rough as gravel. Or should I say, Sect Master Li Wei. We've been waiting. Li Wei rose slowly, his mind racing. He recognized them from the fragmented memories, debt collectors from the Jade Coin Consortium. The details came in flashes, loans taken by the previous master, interest compounding over years, collateral pledged and repledged until nothing remained but this hall and the mountain it stood on. You have until noon to settle the account, the collector continued, unrolling the scroll. 5,000 spirit stones, plus penalties for late payment. The consortium is not in the business of charity. One of the other men, a burly fellow with arms like tree trunks, cracked his knuckles. Or we take the hall. And whatever's left in it. Li Wei's eyes scanned the room. His modern mind assessed, 3 opponents, potentially armed, in a space with poor cover. No weapons visible on his person. The hall's only advantages were its size and the debris scattered about, broken furniture, fallen tiles. But violence wasn't the answer here. He could feel it in the way the collectors stood, not as warriors but as enforcers. This was about money, not honor. Then something shifted in his perception. A pressure built behind his eyes, subtle at first, like the beginning of a headache. Colors seemed to sharpen. The dust motes glowed briefly. And when he looked at the collectors, he saw more than just men. Over the scarred leader, faint golden characters flickered, dead enforcer, skilled in intimidation and contract law. Weakness, overconfidence in established authority. The burly man, muscle, relies on physical threat. Weakness, poor lateral thinking. The third, a lean man with watchful eyes, observer, notes details for reporting. Weakness, hesitates without direct orders. Li Wei blinked. The characters faded, but the knowledge remained. Dynasty Architect's gaze. The name came to him unbidden, along with the understanding of its cost, a minor mental strain, like focusing too long on a complex problem. He could use it, but sparingly. His gaze drifted past the collectors to the hall's entrance. A figure stood there, half hidden in shadow. A vagrant, by the look of him, threadbare robes, unkempt hair, face smudged with dirt. He leaned against the doorframe as if the world had worn him down to this single point of rest. But when Li Wei focused, the pressure behind his eyes returned. Golden characters bloomed around the vagrant, brighter and more complex than those over the collectors, Kong Ming, potential, conqueror strategic mind. Latent talents, grand strategy, fortification design, logistical planning. Current state, penniless, disillusioned, seeking purpose. Weakness, lacks resources to implement visions. The words hung in Li Wei's mind. Conqueror strategic mind. This wasn't just a beggar, this was someone who could shape battles, maybe even kingdoms. And he was standing right there. Well, the scarred collector demanded. Do you have the stones, or do we start removing fixtures? Li Wei turned back to them, his modern strategist's instincts kicking in. Negotiation. Leverage. Time. The Azure Cloud Sect has been here for 3 centuries, he said, keeping his voice calm. This hall has seen masters who could split mountains with a thought. Do you really think its value is only in its wood and stone? The collector's sneer deepened. Sentiment doesn't pay debts. No, Li Wei agreed. But services might. He gestured vaguely toward the hall's interior. The sect may be diminished, but we still have knowledge. Artifacts for bartering. Skills that could be of use to the consortium. The observer spoke up, his voice quieter. What kind of services? Protection, Li Wei said, the idea forming even as he spoke. Escort through the mountain passes. Consultation on territorial disputes. The Azure Cloud name still carries weight in some circles. It was a bluff, mostly. But bluffs worked when the other side couldn't see your cards. The muscle shifted impatiently. We're not here to hire you. You're here to collect, Li Wei said. And if you seize this hall, what do you get? A crumbling building on a remote mountain. The consortium would have to spend more to repair it than it's worth. But if you grant an extension, say, 3 months, you get the possibility of full repayment plus interest. And if I fail, you still get the hall. No loss to you. He saw the calculation in their eyes. The observer was already nodding slightly. The muscle looked confused. The scarred leader studied him, then glanced at the vagrant by the door. Who's he? My first disciple, Li Wei said without hesitation. The vagrant's head lifted slightly. His eyes, previously dull, sharpened with interest. The collector laughed, a short, harsh sound. A disciple? He looks like he hasn't eaten in a week. Appearances can be deceiving, Li Wei said. He walked toward the vagrant, feeling the collector's eyes on his back. The mental strain from using the gaze was a faint throb now, manageable. He stopped before the man, who straightened slowly, as if remembering how to stand tall. What's your name? Li Wei asked. The vagrant's voice was rough from disuse. They call me Kong. Kong Ming, Li Wei said, the name feeling right. I am Li Wei, master of the Azure Cloud Sect. We have no wealth. No followers. Only debt and this broken hull. But I see something in you. A mind that could build fortresses. Plan campaigns. Shape the flow of armies. Kong Ming's eyes widened. For a moment, the dirt and weariness seemed to fall away, revealing intelligence burning beneath. How could you know that? I have a gift for seeing potential, Li Wei said. And I'm offering you a purpose. Help me rebuild this sect. Not as a martial school, but as something greater. A place where strategy matters as much as strength. Where we don't just cultivate chi, we cultivate influence. He extended a hand. Kong Ming looked at it, then at the hall, then at the collectors watching them. His expression shifted through doubt, curiosity, and finally, a slow, dawning resolve. He took Li Wei's hand. His grip was firm, calloused from hardship but steady. I have nowhere else to go, he said simply. Li Wei turned back to the collectors. You see. The rebuilding has already begun. 3 months. That's all I ask. The scarred leader rolled up the scroll with a snap. 3 months. Not a day more. And if you try to flee, the consortium has eyes everywhere. He pointed a finger at Li Wei. Remember, you're not the first sect master to make promises in this hall. They left, their footsteps fading down the mountain path. The silence they left behind was different now, not empty, but charged with possibility. Li Wei let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The mental strain from using the gaze faded to a dull background hum. He looked at Kong Ming, who was already surveying the hall with new eyes. It's worse than I thought, Kong Ming said, his voice losing its roughness as he spoke. The foundation is sound, but the defenses are non-existent. Windows are arrow slits waiting to happen. The gate is wood, it might as well be paper. We'll fix it, Li Wei said. But first, we need a plan. Kong Ming nodded. He knelt, brushing dust from a section of floor. From a fold in his robes, he produced a piece of charcoal. Where he'd been hiding it, Li Wei couldn't guess. With quick, sure strokes, he began to sketch on the wooden planks. This mountain, Kong Ming said, drawing a rough peak. The Azure Cloud Sect sits here, on the southern slope. Below us, the valley. To the east, the trade road that connects the Iron Fist Kingdom to the merchant cities. To the west, the wildlands where bandits hide. His charcoal moved, tracing lines and circles. Li Wei watched, fascinated. This wasn't just a map, it was an analysis. Kong Ming marked elevations, water sources, choke points. Master, Kong Ming said, his voice taking on a new intensity. First we must secure the mountain pass, it's defensible and controls regional trade. He tapped a point on his drawing, a narrow gap between two cliffs. Whoever holds that pass controls who enters the valley. Right now, it's unguarded. Bandits use it. Merchants avoid it. But if we fortify it, we can charge tolls. Protect caravans. Gather intelligence on everyone who passes through. He looked up, his eyes alight. It's not just a defensive position. It's a source of income. A way to make the consortium's debt manageable. And it's the first step toward making this sect matter again. Li Wei stared at the crude map, at the pass Kong Ming had marked. In his modern world, he'd studied choke points in supply lines, key terrain in military simulations. But here, drawn in charcoal on a dusty floor, it felt real. Tangible. This was no longer about surviving debt collectors, it was about building something. And his first disciple, this penniless vagrant with a conqueror's mind, had seen it in minutes. How do we take the pass? Li Wei asked. Kong Ming smiled, a thin, sharp expression. With cunning, master. And the one thing we have in abundance, desperation. The sun climbed higher, its light warming the cold hall. Outside, a bird called, its cry echoing through the empty mountains. Li Wei looked from the map to Kong Ming, then to the broken throne at the end of the hall. The weight of debt still pressed on him, but now there was something else too, a path forward, drawn in charcoal and vision. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Azure Cloud Sect's territory, revealing the full extent of its decay. Li Wei stood beside Kong Ming at the edge of what had once been a proper courtyard, now little more than a weed-choked clearing dotted with crumbling stone foundations. A chill wind swept down from the mountain peaks, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Kong Ming knelt, his fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. Master, our territory consists of this main hall. He gestured toward the dilapidated wooden structure behind them, its roof sagging like a tired beast, and approximately 3 li of mountain slope ending at that ridge. He pointed to a jagged line of rock that marked their northern boundary. The Jade Coin Consortium gave us 3 months. Bandits and rival sects won't wait that long. Li Wei activated his Dynasty architect's gaze, the world shifting subtly around him. Colors intensified at points of potential, a faint golden glow around Kong Ming's head where strategic brilliance simmered, but elsewhere, the landscape appeared mostly mundane. He focused on the physical defenses, or lack thereof. The so-called walls were collapsed stone piles overgrown with vines. The single mountain path leading to their hall was barely visible beneath fallen branches and erosion gullies. Any child with a slingshot could approach unseen from 3 different directions. Show me everything, Li Wei said, his modern mind already cataloging vulnerabilities. Every approach, every blind spot. For the next 2 hours, they walked the perimeter. Kong Ming moved with surprising grace for someone who'd been a vagrant, his eyes missing nothing. He paused at a narrow defile where the path squeezed between 2 boulders. Natural choke point, he murmured. But look. He kicked aside loose shale to reveal how easily the rocks could be dislodged from above. An ambush position for them, not us. Further along, they found what had once been a watchtower, now just a rotten timber skeleton clinging to a cliff edge. Kong Ming tested a beam, it crumbled like dry bread. The previous sect masters focused on cultivation chambers and meditation gardens, he said without looking up. They forgot that walls keep out more than distracting thoughts. Li Wei's mind raced with calculations. They had no money, barely any food, and 3 debt collectors who'd return with more muscle. But they did have something, position. The mountain pass Kong Ming had identified yesterday wasn't just defensible, it controlled access to a trade route barely visible from below, where merchant caravans moved like ants along a distant valley floor. We need labor, Li Wei said finally. People who can rebuild what's here, not just martial artists. Kong Ming nodded. The village at the mountain's base. They've avoided us since the sect's decline, but they know stonework and timber. The village of Pine Creek huddled in the shadow of the Azure Cloud Mountain like a child clinging to its mother's skirts. 20-odd houses of rough-hewn wood and fieldstone, smoke curling from clay chimneys. The villagers watched their approach with wary eyes, hands resting on tools, axes, hoes, a woodcutter's saw. Li Wei activated his Dynasty architect's gaze again, feeling the slight strain at his temples. This wasn't like assessing Kong Ming's brilliant potential, this was searching for subtler sparks. He scanned the gathered villagers. Most showed nothing, the dull grays of ordinary life. But here and there. An older man with hands permanently stained with clay had a faint blue shimmer around his fingers. Pottery, yes, but something more. Structural understanding. A woman directing children with precise gestures had a similar glow, organizational aptitude. And a young man leaning on a digging staff. Li Wei focused. There it was, a network of thin golden lines around his eyes, mapping terrain in his mind even as he stood still. Surveyor's instinct. We offer fair work, Li Wei announced, keeping his voice steady. The Azure Cloud Sect needs walls rebuilt, paths cleared, defenses established. Payment in sect artifacts and future protection. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The village elder, a bent man with a beard like frost on dead grass, stepped forward. The last sect master promised protection too. Then bandits took half our autumn harvest while your people meditated. Kong Ming spoke before Li Wei could respond. We're not them. His voice carried a quiet certainty that stilled the murmurs. The bandits came from the western gully, yes. Took your grain stores first, then the livestock. The elder blinked. How? Because that's what I would do, Kong Ming said matter-of-factly. The gully offers cover until 50 paces from your storage barn. Your dogs would bark at eastern approaches first, the wind usually comes from that direction. He knelt, sketching in the dirt. But if we fortify this ridge here, and create a watch rotation with signal fires. Li Wei watched as Kong Ming's words wove a net of practical security around the villagers' fears. Not promises of mystical martial prowess, but simple, observable cause and effect. If we build X, then Y becomes safer. The elder's suspicion slowly thawed into cautious interest. 6 villagers agreed to work, the pottery-handed man, introduced as Old Tan, the organized woman, Auntie May, the young surveyor, Lin, and 3 others with general labor skills. Their payment would come from the sect's remaining artifacts, mostly ceremonial items of polished jade and carved wood that had survived the decline because they were useless for actual cultivation. Back at the sect, Kong Ming transformed. With charcoal from the cold hearth and scraps of parchment, he sketched defenses that made Li Wei's modern strategic mind hum with recognition. This wasn't just building walls, it was creating a system. See here, Kong Ming pointed to his drawing of the main approach. We don't have the stone to build a proper gatehouse. But we can create a killing zone. He indicated a series of shallow pits along the path. Dig these here, line them with sharpened stakes, cover with woven mats and leaves. Bandits rushing up the path won't see them until they're impaled. Old Tan examined the drawing, his stained fingers tracing the lines. The soil's rocky here. Digging will be hard. Then we make that work for us, Kong Ming said. Use the rocks we dig up to build cairns here and here. He indicated flanking positions. From behind those, defenders can rain arrows or thrown stones on anyone trapped in the pits. Lin, the young surveyor, spoke up. The water source. He pointed to a stream marked on Kong Ming's crude map. It comes from a spring above us. If someone poisons it. Kong Ming nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. We build a covered stone cistern here, with a locking grate. And post a guard rotation once we have more people. While Kong Ming directed the fortifications, Li Wei sorted through the sect's remaining valuables. The artifacts were fewer than he'd hoped, 3 jade tablets inscribed with meaningless platitudes about inner harmony, a set of bronze meditation bells, and a carved wooden statue of some forgotten sect ancestor. Hardly the treasure trove needed to fund a rebuilding project. He took the artifacts down to Pine Creek's trading post, a single-room shack where a merchant named Bao with a perpetual squint bartered goods from passing caravans. Bao examined the jade tablets with practiced disinterest. Pretty carvings, he said, holding one up to the light. But the energies faded. Cultivators want artifacts that still hold chi resonance. These. He shrugged. Decoration for a rich man's garden, maybe. Li Wei felt desperation clawing at his throat. He needed those supplies, rope, nails, tools, food for the workers. What if their value isn't in chi, he said, thinking fast. What if it's in provenance? These come from the Azure Cloud Sect, founded 3 centuries ago by Master Cloudwalker himself. That's history. That's prestige. Bao's squint deepened. Merchants don't care about history. They care about profit. Exactly, Li Wei pressed. Sell these to collectors in the capital who want to own a piece of legendary sections. Mark them up as rare artifacts from before the Great Schism. You know the market better than I do, what would those kinds of buyers pay? A slow smile spread across Bao's face. You're not like the usual cultivators, are you? He hefted the wooden statue. This one's actually decent craftsmanship. The jade, maybe. But I'll need most of the profit for finding the right buyers. They haggled for an hour. Li Wei traded all the artifacts for a cartload of supplies, coils of hemp rope, iron nails, 2 saws, 3 hammers, and, most crucially, 10 sacks of rice and dried beans. It was a fraction of what the items might eventually sell for, but it was immediate, tangible, and necessary. Over the next 5 days, the mountain transformed through sheer exertion. Li Wei worked alongside the villagers, his modern muscles protesting at the unaccustomed labor of hauling stones and digging earth. Sweat soaked through his simple sect robes, and blisters rose on his palms. But he watched Kong Ming with growing awe. The former vagrant moved between tasks with relentless efficiency. When Lin reported that the planned pit traps would require moving a boulder too large for their manpower, Kong Ming didn't order them to work harder. He examined the slope, calculated angles, and had them dig a trench beneath the boulder instead, letting gravity do the work when they levered it free. The boulder rolled precisely into position as an additional barrier. Old Tan proved invaluable. His understanding of materials went beyond pottery. He showed them how to mix clay and gravel to create a crude but effective mortar for repairing the collapsed walls. Auntie May organized the work rotations and food distribution with such quiet competence that no one went hungry despite their limited stores. On the 3rd day, bandits came. Not a proper attack, just 3 scruffy men with clubs who thought a weakened sect would be easy picking. They came up the eastern path, the one Kong Ming had identified as least defensible. They didn't see the tripwire Lin had strung between 2 trees, nor the net of woven vines hidden beneath leaves. The first bandit went down with a yelp as the net snapped up around him, hoisting him dangling 5 feet off the ground. The second tripped over the concealed pit behind it, tumbling into a hole lined with non-lethal but painful thorn branches. The third froze, staring at his trapped companions, then at the newly repaired wall ahead where Kong Ming stood watching calmly. You can carry your friends back down, Kong Ming called down. Or leave them. Your choice. The bandit chose to flee alone. The trapped men were released after swearing, with convincing terror, never to return. The incident cost no resources, injured no defenders, and demonstrated the system worked. But success had costs. Li Wei inventoried their remaining supplies on the evening of the 5th day. The rice sacks were half empty. The beans nearly gone. They'd used all the nails and most of the rope. The fortifications stood stronger, the main path now had 3-layered trap zones, the worst wall breaches were patched, and a proper watch schedule rotated between the workers. But their food would last maybe 4 more days at current rationing. Kong Ming joined him at the storage room doorway. The defenses will hold against small groups, he said quietly. But organized force, we need more time. And more people. Li Wei nodded, exhaustion weighing his bones. Wheel. The shout came from Lin at the newly repaired gate. Rider approaching. They moved to the wall. A single horseman came up the path at a deliberate pace, his green robes marked with a blade-shaped insignia. He rode straight through the first trap zone without triggering anything, not because he avoided it, but because he clearly knew exactly where the triggers were. He'd been watching. The rider reined in 20 paces from the gate. He was young, clean-shaven, with the confident posture of someone representing power. I bring word from the Verdant Blade sect, he called out, his voice carrying easily. You have occupied territory under our protection. The tribute is 50 spirit stones monthly, or equivalent value. Li Wei felt cold settle in his stomach. They had maybe 3 spirit stones left from the artifact sale, and those were needed for essential repairs. We were unaware of any protection arrangement, he called back, buying time. The rider smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. You are now. The tribute is due in 3 days. If it's not delivered. He gestured vaguely at their fortifications. Well. Let's say bandits become bolder in unprotected territories. He turned his horse without waiting for response and rode back down the path, leaving silence behind him. Kong Ming's face was stone. They've been observing us. They waited until we spent our resources on defenses, then made their demand. Li Wei looked at their half-empty rice sacks, at the exhausted villagers, at the fortifications that suddenly seemed terribly fragile. The Verdant Blade sect hadn't arrived by coincidence. They'd calculated their timing perfectly. And in 3 days, they'd expect payment for protection from the very threats they likely controlled or encouraged. The mountain pass was fortified against bandits, but this was a different kind of siege entirely. Auntie May approached, her face grim. "Master Li," she said softly. "The children's ration, we've cut it to bones already. After tomorrow." She didn't finish. Li Wei looked from her worried eyes to Kong Ming's strategic calculations, to the green-robed rider disappearing down the mountain path. The walls were built. The traps were set. But the real battle, he realized with sinking certainty, had just begun at their doorstep. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Azure Cloud Sect's courtyard, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like forgotten spirits. Li Wei stood before the sect's modest herb garden, his fingers brushing against the leaves of silver root and ghost bloom. The plants were the last tangible assets they hadn't traded away, their medicinal properties well known in the region, but their market value modest at best. Kong Ming approached, his threadbare robes fluttering in the mountain breeze. "Master, the verdant blade scout left with our refusal, but he didn't look pleased. We have perhaps 3 days before they return with more than words." Li Wei nodded, his mind already calculating. "Our food stores will last 2 days if we ration. The mountain pass defenses are functional but untested against organized martial forces." He knelt, carefully harvesting a bundle of ghost bloom, its purple flowers releasing a faint, earthy scent. "I'm taking these to Riverbend Market. We need currency, not just supplies." Kong Ming's eyes narrowed. "Alone?" "The road. I'll take the southern trail. Less traveled, longer, but safer from bandits." Li Wei secured the herbs in a worn cloth sack. "Maintain the watch rotations. If the verdant blade returns early, use the terrain traps as we planned." ******. Riverbend Market sprawled along the banks of the Jade River, a chaotic tapestry of stalls, tents, and makeshift shops. The air hummed with competing smells, spices, roasting meat, animal dung, and the ever-present river mud. Merchants shouted prices, customers haggled, and children darted between legs carrying messages or stolen fruit. Li Wei found a space near the alchemy quarter, laying his herbs on a faded blanket. For 2 hours, he sold small bundles to passing healers and minor cultivators, earning barely enough copper coins to buy a single day's rice. His modern mind chafed at the inefficiency. These herbs had value, but the market was saturated, prices driven down by bulk traders from the eastern plains. Then he heard the laughter. 3 stalls down, a young man in stained alchemist robes was being jeered by a crowd. "Another failure, Xiao Feng," shouted a burly herb seller. "That's the 3rd batch this month that turned to sludge." The man, Xiao Feng, stood stiffly, his hands clenched at his sides. On his table sat several clay pots, their contents emitting a foul, sulphurous odor. Li Wei's gaze sharpened. Almost unconsciously, he activated his Dynasty architect's gaze. The world shifted. Colors deepened, patterns emerged where none had been visible. The laughing crowd became a blur of muted oranges and reds, anger, mockery, petty satisfaction. But Xiao Feng. Xiao Feng glowed with intricate, interlocking patterns of emerald and gold. Lines connected like economic supply chains, branching into talent trees Li Wei had never seen before. He focused, feeling the moderate strain the ability demanded, like holding multiple complex equations in his mind simultaneously. Talent revealed, economic warfare genius. Sub-talents unfolded, market manipulation, intermediate, supply chain disruption, novice, price-fixing theory, advanced, resource monopoly strategies, latent. The patterns showed not just knowledge, but instinct, an innate understanding of how value flowed, how scarcity could be manufactured, how entire economies could be weaponized. Li Wei approached as the crowd dispersed, leaving Xiao Feng staring at his failed potions with hollow eyes. Up close, the young alchemist looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, fingers stained with chemical burns. "Your fire lotus extract was overheated during the 3rd distillation phase," Li Wei said quietly. Xiao Feng's head jerked up. "What?" "The sulfur smell. Classic sign of thermal decomposition in lotus-based elixirs. You needed a cooling talisman during the critical phase, but I'm guessing you couldn't afford one." The alchemist's defensive posture softened slightly. "The market price for cooling talismans has tripled since the Iron Fist Kingdom restricted jade exports. I tried using ice runes instead, but..." He gestured helplessly at the pots. Li Wei knelt, examining the failed mixtures. These ingredients, fire lotus, sungrass, powdered obsidian. You were attempting a basic cultivation accelerator, yes. But the recipe assumes stable thermal conditions. You know alchemy? No. But I know systems. And I know wasted potential when I see it. Li Wei met his eyes. My name is Li Wei. I lead the Azure Cloud Sect. Xiao Feng snorted. The bankrupt sect on the mountain. I've heard the rumors. Debt collectors circling like vultures. We have something you don't. Space. A proper laboratory, isolated from market noise. Equipment that needs only repair, not purchase. Li Wei gestured to the herbs on his blanket. I also have resources. Not much, but enough to experiment properly. Why would you offer this? Because I see what you could be. Not just an alchemist, but an architect of economies. Li Wei lowered his voice. Look around. This market operates on simple supply and demand. Herbs come from gatherers, go to alchemists, get sold to cultivators. But what if someone could reshape that flow? Xiao Feng's eyes flickered with sudden intensity. You're talking about manipulation. I'm talking about strategy. The Azure Cloud Sect needs income. You need a laboratory. Our problems have intersecting solutions. For a long moment, Xiao Feng studied him, then the failed potions, then the bustling market. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, sharper, more analytical. Ghost bloom. You're selling ghost bloom. Common ingredient in pain-numbing salves. Price has been stable at 5 copper per bundle for years. And there are 3 major suppliers in this region. All harvest from the western marshes. The marshes flood seasonally in 2 weeks. Xiao Feng's fingers traced invisible lines in the air. If someone were to purchase their existing stock quietly, then create a rumor about marsh blight affecting next season's crop. Li Wei felt a chill that wasn't from the river breeze. You'd create artificial scarcity. Prices would triple within days. Maybe quintuple if the rumor spread to neighboring towns. Xiao Feng's gaze grew distant, calculating. We'd need capital to buy the initial stock. Not much, 50 silver would control 30% of the local supply. Then we release the rumor through traveling merchants, maybe stage a discovery of blighted plants near the marsh edge. And when prices peak, we sell. We sell carefully. Through intermediaries. Never directly. The major merchants would notice otherwise. Xiao Feng leaned forward, his earlier defeat replaced by fierce focus. But there are risks. The herb sellers will be angry when they realize they sold low. The alchemists who depend on ghost bloom will pay more for their supplies. We'd be creating enemies. Li Wei considered. The Verdant Blade sect demanded tribute. Their food stores were nearly empty. The debt to the Jade Coin Consortium loomed like a storm cloud. How much could we make? With 50 silver investment. 200 silver profit, minimum. Enough to pay your most urgent debts and stock your pantry for a month. Xiao Feng paused. If you're willing to be ruthless. Ruthlessness is a luxury we don't have. Necessity, however. Li Wei stood, offering a hand. The laboratory awaits. As does history. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. 3 days later, the ghost bloom market in Riverbend began to tremble. It started subtly. Old Man Chen, who supplied 3 apothecaries, found his usual harvest diminished. The marsh waters rose early, he grumbled to anyone who would listen. Root systems damaged. Then traveling merchant Bao, the same Bao who had traded supplies for sect artifacts, returned from the western road with alarming news. Saw patches of black rot near the harvesting grounds. Whole sections of ghost bloom withered. By the 4th day, the price had doubled. Alchemists began buying in bulk, fearing shortage. Xiao Feng, working from the repaired laboratory in the Azure Cloud Sect's eastern wing, monitored the market through a network of paid informants, street children who reported price changes for copper coins. We need to accelerate, he told Li Wei on the evening of the 5th day. They stood in the laboratory, which now held properly organized shelves, repaired distillation equipment, and detailed market charts Xiao Feng had created. The major merchants are getting suspicious. One of them sent guards to check the marshes personally. How long until they discover the rot is only in a small, staged area? 2 days. Maybe 3 if it rains and muddies the trails. Xiao Feng pointed to a chart showing ghost bloom inventory across 7 sellers. We've acquired 40% of the available stock through 4 different buyers. Time to sell. They worked through the night. Xiao Feng's economic mind proved frighteningly precise. He calculated optimal selling prices based on time of day, which merchants had urgent orders to fill, which alchemists were most desperate. Li Wei handled the logistics, using Kong Ming's knowledge of hidden mountain paths to move herbs between intermediaries. By dawn of the 7th day, they had converted 50 silver into 280 silver coins, a profit that made Li Wei's modern sensibilities recoil even as his survival instincts celebrated. They paid the most aggressive debt collectors, purchased 6 carts of grain and preserved meats, and even bought proper tools for Old Tan's fortification work. But as the silver flowed in, so did the anger. On the 8th day, Li Wei stood at the sect's newly repaired gate, discussing watch schedules with Kong Ming, when 5 men appeared on the mountain trail. They moved with the confident stride of professional enforcers, muscular, armed with weighted clubs and short swords, their tunics bearing the embroidered symbol of the Riverbend Merchant Guild. The leader, a man with a nose that had been broken multiple times, stopped 10 paces from the gate. His eyes swept the repaired walls, the strategically placed watch posts, the subtle signs of trap placements Kong Ming had designed. Li Wei of the Azure Cloud Sect, the man called, his voice carrying in the thin mountain air. The guild knows what you've done. Artificial scarcity. Price manipulation. You've broken market covenants that have stood for generations. Li Wei stepped forward, keeping his expression neutral. I'm not familiar with these covenants. Don't play ignorant. The enforcer's hand rested on his sword hilt. You and that disgraced alchemist bought up Ghost Bloom, spread false rumors about Blight, then sold at inflated prices. You've stolen from every honest merchant in Riverbend. Behind him, Kong Ming shifted position slightly, his hand moving toward the hidden lever that would trigger the first line of pit traps. Old Tan and 2 other villagers appeared on the wall above, holding makeshift weapons, sharpened stakes, hunting bows. We've committed no theft, Li Wei said calmly. We bought herbs at market price. We sold herbs at market price. The market decided the value. The market was lied to, the enforcer snapped. You have until sunset to return all profits to the guild for redistribution. Plus a 50% penalty for disruption. If not. He gestured to his men. The Azure Cloud Sect will learn why merchants hire martial enforcers. As the man spoke, Li Wei noticed movement further down the trail. More figures approaching, at least a dozen, these ones wearing the green-trimmed robes of the Verdant Blade sect. They moved with cultivator's grace, weapons clearly visible. 2 threats. 1 gate. And somewhere in the laboratory behind him, Xiao Feng was probably calculating the economic impact of a sect being destroyed versus the cost of paying bribes. Li Wei took a slow breath, the mountain air cold in his lungs. The silver coins in their newly filled coffers suddenly felt terribly, dangerously heavy. The sun hung low over the Azure Cloud Sect's gate, casting long shadows that stretched like accusing fingers across the dusty courtyard. 5 enforcers from the Riverbend Merchant Guild stood rigidly, their leather armor creaking with each impatient shift. At their head, a burly man with a thick beard and cold eyes, the enforcer leader, folded his arms, his gaze fixed on Li Wei. Behind him, 4 others, including 2 low-level martial artists with coiled stances, radiated a simmering threat. The air tasted of dust and tension, thick enough to choke on. Li Wei stood before them, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the sect's precarious position pressing down on him, the recent financial windfall from Xiao Feng's herb scheme now a double-edged sword. To his left, Kong Ming leaned casually against the repaired gatepost, his eyes scanning the enforcers with the detached focus of a strategist assessing a battlefield. To his right, Xiao Feng fidgeted slightly, his hands tucked into his sleeves, where they doubtless clutched vials of something volatile. We demand compensation, the enforcer leader barked, his voice cutting through the silence. 200 silver for the profits you stole, another 100 as penalty, and the surrender of that alchemist. He jabbed a thick finger toward Xiao Feng. The guild does not tolerate market manipulation. Li Wei took a slow breath, letting the demand hang in the air. He activated his Dynasty architect's gaze, a subtle shift in perception that made the world sharpen into layers of potential and weakness. The enforcer leader glowed with a mundane aura, greed-driven, predictable, his loyalty bought by coin. The 2 martial artists beside him flickered with low-grade combat prowess, but their stances were rigid, trained for intimidation rather than adaptability. The other 2 enforcers were mere thugs, their weaknesses written in sloppy footwork and nervous glances toward the sect's shadowed buildings. It was a bluff, Li Wei realized, a show of force meant to cow them into submission. But bluffs could be called. The guild's concerns are noted, Li Wei said, his voice calm, almost conversational. But surrender is not an option. We propose an alternative. Kong Ming pushed off the gatepost, a faint smile playing on his lips. Without a word, he gestured toward the trees lining the path behind the enforcers. From within the foliage, a series of faint clicks echoed, the sound of traps being reset, amplified by the acoustics of the mountain pass. Then, from the direction of the sect's main hall, came the distinct scrape of wood on stone, followed by the muffled thud of what sounded like heavy footsteps. It was an illusion, crafted from Kong Ming's earlier fortifications, Old Tan and Anti-Mei, hidden from view, moving debris to simulate reinforcements. The enforcers tensed, their eyes darting toward the noises. We have more pressing matters than a guild dispute, Kong Ming said, his tone lazy but edged with steel. The Verdant Blade sect watches from the ridges, and bandits lurk in the valleys. Would the guild risk its men in a fight that benefits only our common enemies? Xiao Feng stepped forward, his earlier nervousness replaced by a sharp, calculating gleam. Instead of penalties, consider a partnership, he said, pulling a small ledger from his sleeve. The Ghost Bloom Herb scheme was crude, but it proves the market's volatility. The guild could leverage our insights, forecasting shortages, stabilizing prices, even creating new trade routes through this pass. In return, we share a percentage of future profits. A steady income stream, rather than a one-time extortion. The enforcer leader's eyes narrowed, greed warring with caution. He glanced at his martial artists, who shifted uneasily as another fake reinforcement noise echoed, this time, Lin's surveyor whistle, blown from a hidden vantage point to mimic a signal. The psychological pressure mounted, each sound chipping away at their confidence. How do we know you won't cheat us again? The leader growled, but his voice had lost some of its bite. Li Wei met his gaze squarely. Because we have more to lose than silver. This sect is our home, and stability serves us all. Attack us, and you gain a handful of coins and a bitter enemy. Work with us, and you gain a strategic ally in a region ripe for exploitation. The negotiation stretched into the late afternoon, the shadows lengthening as terms were haggled over. Li Wei's modern knowledge of economics lent weight to Xiao Feng's proposals, while Kong Ming's staged distractions kept the enforcers off balance. In the end, a tense truce was struck. The Azure Cloud Sect would pay 50 silver as a goodwill gesture and commit to sharing 20% of profits from future economic ventures with the guild. No one was surrendered, no further penalties imposed, but the cost was a leash on their financial freedom. As the enforcers departed, their footsteps fading down the mountain path, Li Wei let out a slow breath. The immediate threat had passed, but the victory felt hollow, bought with future concessions. Kong Ming approached, his expression grim. They'll be back if we falter, he murmured. And we have another problem. From the ridge above, a figure emerged, not a guild enforcer or a Verdant Blade scout, but a rider in polished armor, the insignia of a clenched fist emblazoned on his chest. He dismounted, his movements efficient and martial, and strode toward the gate with an authority that made the earlier enforcers seem like children playing at war. Li Wei of the Azure Cloud Sect, the rider called, his voice carrying the weight of command. The Iron Fist Kingdom has taken notice of your economic activities. An envoy will arrive in 3 days to investigate. Prepare to account for your actions. He turned without waiting for a reply, remounting and riding back the way he came. Li Wei stared after him, the name Iron Fist Kingdom echoing in his mind like a death knell. This was no minor sect or merchant guild, this was a martial power, a kingdom that could crush them with a mere fraction of its army. The cliffside wind picked up, cold and biting, as the last light of day bled from the sky. Kong Ming's hand settled on his shoulder. We've survived a firestorm, he said quietly. But the real war is just beginning. In the gathering dusk, Li Wei looked at his disciples, Kong Ming with his strategic mind, Xiao Feng with his economic cunning, and felt a flicker of dread, tempered by a stubborn resolve. They had bluffed their way through one crisis, but the Iron Fist Kingdom would not be so easily fooled. The mountain pass, once a symbol of defense, now felt like a target painted on their backs. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Azure Cloud Sect's courtyard, where Li Wei stood poring over a crude map spread across a weathered stone table. 3 days. The Iron Fist Kingdom's envoy would arrive in 3 days, and every instinct in his modern strategist's mind screamed that preparation was insufficient. Master Li, Kong Ming's voice came from behind him, unusually formal. The first disciple approached with Xiao Feng trailing slightly, both wearing expressions of studied innocence that immediately set off alarms in Li Wei's mind. We've completed inventory of the remaining ghost bloom herbs, Xiao Feng said, his alchemist's hands gesturing vaguely. The quality is acceptable for basic medicinal preparations. Li Wei's eyes narrowed. Something was off. Kong Ming's posture was too rigid, Xiao Feng's gaze too carefully averted. Where are Old Tan and the others? He asked, his voice deliberately casual. Surveying the western ridge, Kong Ming answered too quickly. Potential landslide risks after last night's rain. The lie was transparent. Li Wei had assigned no such task. Before he could press further, both disciples bowed shallowly and retreated toward the sect gates, murmuring about checking perimeter defenses. A cold unease settled in Li Wei's stomach. He watched them disappear down the mountain path with 4 of the more capable villagers, not toward the western ridge, but northeast, toward the valley where the struggling settlement of Pine Creek Village lay. No, Li Wei breathed, the realization dawning. He scrambled to the highest watchtower they'd repaired, his heart pounding against his ribs. From this vantage, he could just make out distant movement through the morning mist, a small group moving with purpose toward the village. He focused, reaching for the Dynasty architect's gaze. The ability normally required proximity, but desperate times demanded desperate measures. Li Wei closed his eyes, visualizing Kong Ming's strategic mind, Xiao Feng's economic cunning, the villagers' hidden talents. He pushed the ability beyond its comfortable limits, extending his perception across the distance. The world swam. Colors bled at the edges of his vision. A sharp pain lanced through his temples as if someone had driven a spike between his eyes. But through the agony, images formed, Kong Ming not as a simple strategist, but as a conqueror seeing territory, resources, population. Xiao Feng not just manipulating markets, but calculating the economic value of an entire settlement's productivity. The villagers not as laborers, but as the seeds of administration. Helping hand, potential, the gaze showed it clearly now. Not charity, but expansion disguised as assistance. His disciples weren't going to help Pine Creek Village, they were going to annex it. Li Wei staggered, catching himself against the watchtower's rough-hewn rail. Blood trickled from his nose, warm and metallic. The mental fatigue was crushing, like he'd run for days without sleep. He wiped his face with a trembling hand, watching helplessly as his disciples vanished into the tree line. In Pine Creek Village, the air smelled of burnt timber and fear. 3 days prior, bandits had struck at dawn, making off with the autumn grain stores and leaving 2 guards dead. The remaining villagers moved through the ruins of their storage barns with the weary movements of people who knew worse was coming. Kong Ming surveyed the scene with a commander's eye. Defensible position, he murmured to Xiao Feng. Natural choke point at the valley entrance, water source secure, arable land to the south. And economically viable, Xiao Feng added, his fingers tracing calculations in the air. Their ceramic kilns are primitive but salvageable. With proper investment, they could produce glazed ware worth 10 times current value at Riverbend Market. They approached the village elder, a woman named Granny Wen whose face was etched with more lines than the mountain paths. Her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd survived 60 harvests in these harsh lands. Azure Cloud Sect offers protection, Kong Ming stated without preamble. In exchange for recognizing our authority over village defense and resource allocation. Granny Wen's gaze swept over them, lingering on the tools the villagers carried, not weapons, but digging implements and measuring cords. You bring no warriors. We bring something better, Xiao Feng said, producing a small pouch of silver. An advance payment for exclusive trading rights. Plus security systems that don't require your people to die holding swords. While negotiations proceeded, Kong Ming moved through the village with Lin, the villager with surveyor's instinct. Together they identified the bandits' likely approach routes, 2 narrow trails through the eastern woods where the terrain dropped sharply into rocky gullies. Here, Kong Ming pointed to a section where the path curved around a massive granite outcrop. Pit traps with sharpened stakes. Not to kill, but to injure and demoralize. Old Tan examined the rock formation, his engineer's mind already working. We could loosen this overhang. A few strategic strikes with hammers, and it comes down on anyone passing beneath. Auntie may organize the villagers with quiet efficiency, assigning tasks based on ability rather than status. The young, the old, even children were put to work gathering stones for barricades or weaving camouflage nets from forest vines. They worked through the day and into the evening, the village transforming from vulnerable settlement to fortified position. Kong Ming's designs were brutally efficient, every trap served multiple purposes, every barricade covered another's blind spot. Xiao Feng meanwhile negotiated with Granny Wan, his economic arguments weaving together security, prosperity, and autonomy in carefully measured proportions. 20% of ceramic profits to the sect, he offered finally. In exchange, we provide guaranteed purchase prices, defense against bandits and rival sects, and technical improvements to your kills. Granny Wen's eyes narrowed. And if the Iron Fist Kingdom objects? Their patrols pass through here twice monthly. Let them object, Kong Ming said, joining them. His voice held the quiet confidence of someone who'd already calculated the odds. A defended village is harder to claim than an undefended one. As dusk painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, the bandits returned. 8 of them, mounted on shaggy mountain ponies, their leader a hulking man with a scar that pulled his lip into a permanent sneer. They expected submission, found instead a village transformed. The first pony screamed as it plunged into a concealed pit, snapping its leg with an audible crack. The rider flew forward, landing hard among carefully placed caltrops that shredded his hands as he tried to rise. Confusion rippled through the bandits. Their leader bellowed orders, urging them forward along the second path, right beneath the granite overhang Old Tan had weakened. At Kong Ming's signal, villagers hidden on the ridge above swung heavy mallets against support wedges. The world seemed to hold its breath for a heartbeat before stone groaned in protest. Then with a roar that echoed through the valley, the overhang collapsed, burying the path in several tons of rock and dust. No bandits were crushed, Kong Ming had calculated the fall zone precisely, but the message was unmistakable. From concealed positions, villagers rose with slings and hunting bows. Not trained warriors, but farmers and craftsmen defending their homes. Their shots were poorly aimed, but numerous enough to create a deadly rain. One bandit took an arrow in the shoulder, another a stone to the temple that dropped him from his saddle. The bandit leader's eyes darted from the blocked path to the injured men to the determined faces emerging from cover. He made a calculation older than kingdoms, risk versus reward, and found the scales tipped against him. With a curse that carried across the sudden silence, he wheeled his pony and fled, his remaining men scrambling after him. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a child's cheer broke the stillness, quickly taken up by others until the whole village was shouting, crying, embracing. Granny Wen approached Kong Ming, her expression unreadable. Your protection comes with chains, she said quietly. Kong Ming met her gaze. All protection does. The question is whose chains chafe less. She studied him for another heartbeat, then nodded once, sharply. The annexation was complete, not through force of arms, but through demonstrated competence and the cold calculus of survival. Back at Azure Cloud Sect, Li Wei watched the sunset with blood still drying beneath his nose. The mental fatigue from extending the Dynasty architect's gaze had left him trembling, his thoughts moving through thick mud. He'd seen enough through the distant connection to understand what had happened, and what was coming. When Kong Ming and Xiao Feng returned with the villagers as night fell, their expressions were triumphant. Pine Creek Village is now under sect protection, Kong Ming reported. Their ceramic production will increase our revenue streams, and the valley provides a buffer against eastern approaches. Li Wei wanted to shout, to demand what madness had possessed them to annex territory days before a major power's envoy arrived. But the words died in his throat as he saw the villagers' faces, Old Tan standing taller, Auntie Mei organizing the returnees with renewed purpose, even Lin looking at Kong Ming with something approaching awe. They'd done it. Without his guidance, without his permission, they'd secured territory, resources, and loyalty. And in doing so, they'd likely signed the sect's death warrant. 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and dread. Li Wei drilled the villagers in basic defensive formations, using his modern knowledge of asymmetric warfare to compensate for their lack of martial training. Xiao Feng calculated supply lines and economic pressures until his fingers were stained with ink. Kong Ming refined the mountain pass defenses until every approach was a killing zone. On the morning of the 3rd day, they came. The Iron Fist Kingdom's envoy arrived not with ceremony, but with implied violence. 20 mounted warriors in polished lamellar armor, their banners bearing the clenched fist insignia that had crushed a dozen minor sections. At their head rode a man in his 40s, his face all sharp angles and cold assessment, his eyes the color of winter sky. He didn't dismount. Didn't offer greetings. Simply reined his warhorse to a stop before the sect gates and let the silence stretch until it became its own threat. Li Wei of Azure Cloud Sect, the envoy's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. You have encroached upon territory under Iron Fist Kingdom protection. Pine Creek Village lies within our sphere of influence. Every villager froze. Kong Ming's hand drifted toward the dagger at his belt. Xiao Feng's face went pale. The envoy's gaze swept over their defenses, their preparations, their obvious lack of traditional martial strength. His lip curled in contempt. Withdraw your people immediately. Surrender the village's leadership for punishment. And pay a tribute of 500 silver as recompense for your insolence. He leaned forward in his saddle, the movement causing his armor to whisper like dead leaves. Fail to comply by sunset tomorrow, and the Iron Fist Kingdom will consider it an act of war. We will burn your sect to the ground, enslave your followers, and mount your head above our gates as warning to other upstarts. The warriors behind him shifted, hands resting on sword hilts. The morning sun glinted off polished steel, off cold eyes, off the certainty of overwhelming force. Choose wisely, the envoy finished, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. Your survival depends on it. He wheeled his horse without waiting for response, his retinue following in perfect formation. The thunder of hooves faded slowly, leaving behind a silence more terrible than any threat. Li Wei looked at his disciples, at Kong Ming's calculating eyes already assessing military options, at Xiao Feng's mind doubtless running economic scenarios, at the villagers' faces filling with dread. He looked at the mountain pass they'd fortified, at the territory they'd claimed, at the impossible situation they'd created. The Iron Fist Kingdom had drawn a line in the dirt. And somehow, against all reason and survival instinct, they would have to cross it. The sun hung low over Pine Creek Village, casting long shadows across the newly repaired thatch roofs and freshly tilled fields. Li Wei stood at the edge of the village square, his eyes scanning the makeshift barricades of sharpened bamboo stakes and piled earth that Kong Ming had directed the villagers to erect. Dust clung to his simple sect robes, and a dull ache throbbed behind his temples, a lingering reminder of the mental strain from using Dynasty architects' gaze to assess the villagers' potential days earlier. The air smelled of damp soil and wood smoke, mingling with the faint scent of fear that seemed to seep from every hut. Kong Ming approached, his face smudged with dirt, a map of the surrounding terrain clutched in his calloused hands. Masterly, the eastern ridge is fortified, but the western pass remains vulnerable. If the Iron Fist Kingdom marches from that direction, they could flank us within hours. His voice was steady, but Li Wei noted the tightness in his jaw, the way his knuckles whitened around the map's edges. Xiao Feng lingered nearby, counting ceramic shards salvaged from the village kills, his fingers tracing calculations in the air as he muttered about supply chains and resource allocation. The 50 silver paid to the merchant guild had left their reserves thin, and the looming tribute demand of 500 silver from the Iron Fist Kingdom felt like a noose tightening around their necks. Li Wei's gaze drifted to the refugees huddled near the village well, a ragged group of 24 souls who had fled bandit raids from the northern valleys. Their clothes were torn, their faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. Among them, a silent woman caught his eye. She sat apart from the others, her posture unnaturally still, her eyes observing the village's movements with a detached intensity. She wore a faded gray tunic, her hair tied back in a simple knot, and her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced as if in meditation. Something about her stillness felt deliberate, a calculated invisibility that set her apart from the weary chaos around her. Taking a deep breath, Li Wei activated Dynasty Architect's gaze. The world sharpened into a web of shimmering lines and colors, each person glowing with faint auras of potential, a villager's knack for carpentry, a child's quick reflexes, an elder's memory for local lore. But the strain was immediate, a sharp pain lanced through his skull, and his vision blurred at the edges. He pushed through, focusing on the silent woman. Her aura was different, a deep, shifting shadow of indigo and silver, pulsing with intricate patterns that spoke of hidden networks, whispered secrets, and unseen movements. Words formed in his mind's eye: shadow network architect. Potential for espionage, intelligence gathering, and covert operations. Latent talent requires activation through trust and purpose. The cost was high, sweat beaded on his forehead, and he swayed slightly, forcing himself to deactivate the ability before he collapsed. Stumbling forward, Li Wei approached the woman. The refugees parted nervously, but she did not flinch, her eyes meeting his with a calm, assessing look. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the mental exertion. "Yi Ling," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried a clarity that cut through the background noise. "I have no home. The bandits took everything." Li Wei knelt, ignoring the dirt staining his robes. "I see something in you, Yi Ling. A talent for seeing what others miss, for moving unseen. My sect is in grave danger. The Iron Fist Kingdom threatens to destroy us all unless we learn their plans. Will you help?" For a long moment, Yi Ling was silent, her gaze drifting to the fortified ridges where Kong Ming's scouts patrolled. Then she nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. I have watched their envoys before. They are arrogant, but their camps are poorly guarded at night. I can slip in, listen, return. Li Wei felt a surge of relief, tempered by the weight of what he was asking. Go. Learn everything, their troop numbers, their generals' intentions, their supply routes. Return before dawn 3 days from now. We must know what we face. Yi Ling rose without another word, melting into the gathering dusk as if she were part of the shadows themselves. The refugees murmured in confusion, but Li Wei turned back to Kong Ming and Xiao Feng. We have a chance now. But we must prepare as if war is already here. Over the next 2 days, Li Wei drove himself and his disciples relentlessly. Kong Ming organized the villagers into shifts, reinforcing the barricades with stones from the creek bed and setting traps of concealed pits and tripwires along the mountain paths. Xiao Feng negotiated with local traders, bartering ceramic goods for iron scraps to fashion crude weapons, his economic mind calculating every advantage. Li Wei's thoughts churned with modern strategies, flanking maneuvers, psychological warfare, supply line disruptions, but the reality of this martial world, where a single cultivator could shatter stone with a fist, made his knowledge feel fragile, like paper against a storm. On the third night, as a thin crescent moon cast silvery light over Pine Creek Village, Yi Ling returned. She appeared at the edge of the firelight, her movements so silent that even Kong Ming, alert as a hawk, did not notice until she was steps away. Her clothes were dustier, her face pale with fatigue, but her eyes burned with focused intensity. Li Wei led her to a secluded hut, the air inside thick with the scent of dried herbs and old wood. What did you find? Li Wei asked, his voice low. Yi Ling spoke in measured tones, her words precise and devoid of emotion. The Iron Fist Kingdom's camp lies 30 li to the west, in the Valley of Stone Serpents. Their general is Zhao Teng, a man known for his ruthlessness. He has already mobilized a battalion of 500 warriors, cultivators trained in heavy infantry tactics. They plan to march in 7 days, using the western pass to avoid the rugged terrain. But their scouts are already active. I saw 3 teams probing the mountain trails today, mapping our defenses. She paused, her gaze steady. Zhao Ting believes this annexation is an insult to the kingdom's authority. He intends to make an example of us, burn the village, execute the leaders, and absorb the survivors as slaves. His reputation is one of expansion without mercy. Li Wei's heart sank. 500 against their handful of disciples and untrained villagers. The numbers were overwhelming, but Yi Ling's intelligence was a lifeline. Anything else? Weaknesses. A supply caravan arrives in 2 days, carrying grain and weapons. It travels with minimal guard, assuming the routes are secure. And Zhao Ting's second-in-command, Captain Luo, is ambitious. He resents the general's harsh methods and may be swayed if approached carefully. As Li Wei absorbed this, a sudden commotion erupted outside. Kong Ming burst into the hut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Master Li. Scouts report movement in the western pass, torchlights, maybe a dozen men. They're testing our traps, probing for weaknesses. Yi Ling's expression tightened. That is the vanguard. Zhao Ting does not wait for his full force, he sends scouts to soften us first. If they report back, the main army will advance sooner. The cliffhanger hung in the air, thick and palpable. Li Wei looked from Yi Ling's weary resolve to Kong Ming's urgent alarm, the weight of the coming storm pressing down on them all. The Iron Fist Kingdom was not just threatening, it was already at their doorstep, and the time for preparation had shrunk to mere hours. The morning mist clung to the western pass like a shroud, dampening the air with a chill that seeped into the bones of Kong Ming's patrol. 5 villagers, armed with makeshift spears and bows, huddled behind rocky outcrops, their breaths visible in the cold. Kong Ming stood apart, his gaze fixed on the narrow trail winding through the mountains, a natural choke point he had fortified with fallen logs and concealed pits. His mind, honed by weeks of strategic planning under Li Wei's guidance, calculated distances and angles, but attention tightened his shoulders. The Iron Fist Kingdom scouts were out there, testing the edges of their newly claimed territory. A rustle in the undergrowth broke the silence. Kong Ming raised a hand, signaling stillness. From the mist, 2 figures emerged, warriors clad in leather armor, their movements cautious but confident. They carried short swords and wore the insignia of a clenched fist on their sleeves. Kong Ming's heart hammered against his ribs, this was no random patrol. These were professionals, probing for weaknesses. As one scout knelt to examine the ground, Kong Ming gave a sharp whistle. Arrows flew from the villagers' positions, thudding into the dirt just short of the scouts, a warning shot. The scouts scrambled back, shouting curses, but did not engage further. They vanished into the mist as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only trampled grass and the lingering scent of sweat and metal. Kong Ming exhaled slowly, his mind already racing. This skirmish was a prelude, a test of their resolve. He knew the real assault would come with numbers they could not match. Back at Pine Creek Village, Li Wei stood in the central square, the weight of the ultimatum pressing down on him like a physical burden. The envoy's words echoed in his mind, withdraw or face total war by sunset tomorrow. Around him, villagers hurried to reinforce palisades under Old Tan's direction, their faces etched with fear and determination. Xiao Feng approached, his usual smug expression replaced by a focused intensity. Masterly, he began, his voice low. The scouts' retreat confirms they are assessing our defenses. But we cannot win a direct fight, not with 500 warriors marching in 7 days. I have an idea, one that targets their logistics. Li Wei nodded, his head throbbing from the strain of recent uses of his Dynasty architect's gaze. He focused on Xiao Feng, activating the ability with a deliberate effort. Visions flickered in his mind, streams and rivers flowing through the mountain valleys, supply lines stretching from the Iron Fist Kingdom's camp, and the delicate balance of local ecosystems. The gaze revealed hidden connections, the water sources the enemy would rely on for their advance, and the potential for alchemical contamination to disrupt them. It was a risky move, with moderate cost in resources and a chance of ecological backlash, but the strategic impact could slow their advance, buying precious time. Show me the details, Li Wei said, his voice steady despite the fatigue. Xiao Feng led him to a makeshift workshop in a village hut, where clay pots and dried herbs lay scattered. Ghost bloom herbs, he explained, picking up a withered plant. Old Man Chen mentioned their harvest has diminished, but I've preserved a small stock. When processed with certain minerals from the riverbeds, they can create a tincture that renders water undrinkable, not lethal, but causing nausea and fatigue. If we contaminate the streams along their likely route, they'll be forced to carry extra water, slowing their march and straining their supplies. Li Wei considered the plan, his modern knowledge warning of environmental damage. But in this martial world, survival outweighed idealism. Execute it discreetly, he ordered. Use Yiling to scout the exact locations and avoid detection. We cannot afford to alert them prematurely. Yiling, the silent refugee, nodded from the shadows. Her movements were fluid, almost ghost-like, as she gathered intelligence on the enemy's camp earlier. Now, she slipped away into the forest, her espionage talents perfect for this task. Over the next day, she mapped the key water sources, a series of small streams that fed into the main river the Iron Fist Kingdom would cross. Under cover of darkness, Xiao Feng and a few trusted villagers applied the alchemical tincture, their actions swift and silent. The moon cast pale light on the rippling water, which soon took on a faint, iridescent sheen. By dawn, the contamination was set, invisible to the untrained eye but potent enough to affect any who drank from it. The effects were felt within hours. Reports from Yiling, delivered via coded messages left in hollow trees, indicated confusion in the enemy camp. Scouts returned with tales of stomach ailments among their comrades, and supply officers argued over water rationing. General Zhao Teng, a burly man with a reputation for brutality, paced his command tent, his face red with fury. Delays, he roared, slamming a fist onto a map table. First, those pathetic villagers resist, now our men fall sick from mountain water. This is no coincidence, it's sabotage. His officers cowered, but one dared to speak. General, our advance is slowed. We must adjust our timeline. Zhao Teng's eyes narrowed. No more adjustments. If they want to play with poisons, we will crush them with force. Order the battalion, full assault in 3 days. Burn their village to the ground and bring me the head of their so-called master. The command echoed through the camp, stirring a frenzy of preparation. Warriors sharpened blades and checked armor, their morale tempered by the recent setbacks but driven by their general's wrath. In Pine Creek Village, Li Wei received Yiling's final report as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the fortified walls. The news was grim, the enemy was enraged, not deterred, and their timeline had accelerated. Kong Ming stood beside him, his expression grim. Master, our patrols report increased activity in the passes. They are mobilizing faster than expected. We have limited martial fighters, mostly villagers with basic training. How do we hold the line? Li Wei's mind raced, the weight of leadership pressing down. He had gambled with resource warfare, and it had bought a few days, but now faced a direct assault they were ill-prepared to withstand. The cliffhanger loomed. In 3 days, 500 warriors would descend upon them, and his sect's survival hinged on unorthodox strategies and the fragile loyalty of his disciples. He looked at Kong Ming, Xiao Feng, and Yi Ling, their diverse talents a chaotic hope against the coming storm. "We prepare for the worst," he said quietly, his voice carrying the strain of a modern strategist trapped in a martial world's chaos. "And we find a way to turn their rage against them." The village fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the distant sound of an enemy drum beating a war rhythm, an ominous promise of the bloodshed to come. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pine Creek Village's newly reinforced walls as Li Wei stood atop the watchtower, his knuckles white where they gripped the rough-hewn wood. Below, villagers hurried with bundles of ceramic shards, Xiao Feng's latest defensive innovation, while Kong Ming drilled a makeshift militia in the central square. The air smelled of damp earth and anxiety. Yi Ling materialized beside him without a sound, her presence as subtle as a shift in the light. She wore simple traveler's robes, her face partially obscured by a woven hat, but her eyes held the sharp focus Li Wei had come to recognize. "The Western scouts have withdrawn," she reported, her voice barely above a whisper. "But they left markers in the pass. General Zhao Teng's vanguard will be here within 2 days." Li Wei's mind raced, calculating resources they didn't have against an enemy they couldn't defeat. The Dynasty architect's gaze flickered at the edge of his consciousness, a constant temptation to see patterns where others saw chaos. He resisted the urge to activate it, the mental strain from the past weeks still throbbed behind his temples like a persistent drumbeat. "We need allies," he said, more to himself than to her. "Not just mercenaries. Someone with enough weight to make Zhao Teng reconsider." Yi Ling inclined her head. "The Verdant Blade sect still demands tribute. The Riverbend Merchant Guild wants reparations. Neither will help without significant concessions. Then we find those who haven't yet declared sides." Li Wei turned, studying the horizon where distant mountains faded into haze. "There are minor sects in the northern valleys, the Whispering Wind Monastery, the Stone Gate Brotherhood. Villages like Oak Hollow that trade with both kingdoms. They're neutral because no one has offered them reason to choose. And what will you offer?" Yi Ling's question held no judgment, only the practical assessment of a strategist. "What we have. Future trade routes through Pine Creek once we secure the pass. Access to Xiao Feng's alchemical innovations. Protection from bandits that the Iron Fist Kingdom ignores." Li Wei's modern mind supplied the terms, mutual defense pacts, economic zones, non-aggression agreements, but translating them into this world's martial diplomacy required careful calibration. "You'll need to move quickly. Assess their leaders, their vulnerabilities, their ambitions." Yi Ling nodded once. "I leave within the hour." As she descended the ladder, Li Wei felt the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. Sending their only espionage asset into uncertain territory while enemies gathered at their doorstep was a gamble worthy of the corporate boardrooms he'd left behind. But survival in this martial world demanded risks that would have bankrupted companies in his old life. 3 days later, the first reports returned via coded messages hidden in merchant caravans. Yi Ling's handwriting was precise, economical. Whispering Wind Monastery's abbot showed interest but demanded immediate silver tribute they couldn't provide. Stone Gate Brotherhood's leader was openly hostile, having lost warriors to Iron Fist Kingdom raids years prior and viewing all outsiders with suspicion. Oak Hollow's village elder expressed sympathy but feared retaliation if discovered. Then, on the 4th morning, a new message arrived wrapped in a bundle of medicinal herbs. Crimson Talon Sect, it read. Minor Martial School in Hidden Valley. Leader, Sect Master Hong. Former mercenary captain. Currently feuding with neighboring Swift River Sect over irrigation rights. Open to negotiation. Arrives tomorrow with 5 disciples to assess terms. Li Wei found Kong Ming and Xiao Feng in the village's makeshift command center, what had once been Granny Wen's storage shed, now filled with maps drawn on cured hides. "We have a potential ally," he said, unrolling Yi Ling's message between them. Xiao Feng's eyes narrowed as he scanned the characters. Crimson Talon. I've heard of them. They specialize in close-quarters combat and valley defense tactics. But their reputation, opportunistic. They've switched allegiances 3 times in the past decade. Exactly why they might deal with us, Kong Ming said, tapping the map where Hidden Valley lay. They need something the established powers won't give them, legitimacy. And we need warriors who know how to defend mountain passes. Li Wei felt the Dynasty architect's gaze stirring, that peculiar sensation of seeing layered potentials beneath surface appearances. He'd avoided using it since the strain in Chapter 6, but now. "I'll need to assess Sect Master Hong personally," he said. "To see if this opportunity is worth the cost." The Crimson Talon delegation arrived at midday, 5 martial artists in rust-red robes led by a man whose presence filled the village gate. Sect Master Hong stood a head taller than his disciples, his face weathered by sun and conflict, a jagged scar running from temple to jaw. His eyes missed nothing, the newly reinforced walls, the villagers' nervous glances, the way Kong Ming's militia held their spears with amateurish but determined grips. "So this is the famous Azure Cloud Sect," Hong said, his voice a low rumble. "I expected more." Li Wei met his gaze without flinching. "We have what matters. Strategic position. Resources. And the will to defend them." Hong's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "The Iron Fist Kingdom has 500 warriors marching this way. You have, what? 50 villagers with sharpened sticks. We have the mountain passes," Kong Ming interjected, stepping forward. "And we know how to use them." A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of ceramic being shaped in the village kilns. Li Wei felt the moment crystallize, this was where modern negotiation tactics met martial world pride. He gestured toward Granny Wen's house, now serving as their meeting hall. "Shall we discuss what Crimson Talon truly needs?" Inside, with herbal tea steaming between them, Li Wei activated the Dynasty architect's gaze. The world sharpened, then fractured into overlapping layers of potential. Sect Master Hong glowed with a complex tapestry of colors, amber for military experience, deep green for territorial ambition, flickering gray for opportunistic tendencies. But beneath it all, Li Wei saw something else, a thread of crimson so dark it was nearly black. "Loyalty to those who prove worthy," he murmured, the words escaping before he could stop them. Hong's eyes snapped to his. "What did you say?" Li Wei blinked, the vision receding as a headache began to pound behind his eyes. He'd seen it clearly now, Hong wasn't just an opportunist. He was a former captain who'd been betrayed by previous employers, left to build his own sect from nothing. What he wanted wasn't just silver or territory. It was proof that an alliance could mean more than temporary convenience. "You need irrigation rights to expand your fields in Hidden Valley," Li Wei said, shifting to practical terms. "The Swift River sect controls the upstream flow. After we secure Pine Creek, we can help you negotiate, or pressure, better terms. In return, you commit warriors to our defense now, and we guarantee future trade privileges through this valley once the pass is secure." Hong studied him for a long moment. "You speak of after, as if victory is certain. My scouts tell me General Zhao Teng has never lost a mountain campaign. He's never fought someone who uses the mountain itself as a weapon," Xiao Feng said from where he leaned against the wall. "Or someone who understands that wars are won by disrupting supply lines as much as battlefield maneuvers." The negotiation stretched through the afternoon. Li Wei offered what little they had, future ceramic production rights, a percentage of any alchemical innovation suitable for martial use, guaranteed neutrality in Crimson Talon's local disputes. Hong demanded more, immediate command of a section of defenses, the right to claim any Iron Fist Kingdom artifacts captured in battle, a formal alliance document to be witnessed by neutral parties. Each concession felt like peeling skin from bone. They were promising resources they didn't yet control, leveraging a future that might never come. But as sunset approached, Hong finally nodded. 20 of my best warriors. They'll arrive by nightfall tomorrow. But understand this, Sect Master Li, if your defenses crumble in the first hour, we withdraw. Crimson Talon survives by recognizing lost causes." The Crimson Talon reinforcements arrived as promised, 20 martial artists moving with the disciplined silence of veterans. They brought their own equipment, reinforced shields, hooked blades designed for mountain terrain, and most importantly, experience defending narrow passes. Kong Ming integrated them into the defense plans, assigning them to the western approach where the terrain favored their skills. The villagers watched with a mixture of hope and trepidation. These were professional warriors, not farmers turned militiamen. Their presence changed the atmosphere in Pine Creek, thickening the air with impending violence. That night, Li Wei stood watch again, the headache from using the gaze now a dull throb behind his eyes. He'd seen the potential in Hong, the thread of loyalty that could be strengthened into something lasting. But he'd also seen the cost. If they failed here, Crimson Talon would abandon them, and word would spread that Azure Cloud Sect made promises it couldn't keep. A flicker of movement at the tree line caught his attention. Then another. Torches bloomed in the darkness beyond the village walls, not the scattered lights of patrols but the organized advance of a military force. "Vanguard," Kong Ming said, appearing at his side. "They're not waiting for the main force." Shouts rose from the walls as sentries spotted the approaching warriors. The Crimson Talon fighters moved without being ordered, taking positions at the murder holes and arrow slits. Their leader, a woman named Jiang with eyes that missed nothing, nodded to Kong Ming. "We hold the gatehouse. Your villagers cover the flanks." Then the night erupted with the sound of combat. Iron Fist Kingdom warriors surged from the tree line, their armor glinting in the torchlight as they charged the village's outer defenses. Arrows whistled through the darkness, some thudding into wooden shields, others finding gaps in the defenses. A section of the newly built palisade shuddered under the impact of a battering ram. Li Wei watched as the battle unfolded below, his modern mind analyzing patterns of attack and defense even as his martial world body tensed for action. This was the test, not just of their fortifications, but of the alliance he'd gambled their future on. As the first Iron Fist warriors breached the outer wall and Crimson Talon fighters met them blade to blade in the narrow gap, the outcome hung balanced on the edge of a knife. The night raid ended with a cacophony of clashing steel and desperate shouts that faded into an uneasy silence. Li Wei stood atop the makeshift palisade of Pine Creek Village, his breath misting in the cold air as he surveyed the aftermath. Bodies of Iron Fist Kingdom warriors lay scattered among the village's outer defenses, their dark armor glinting under the pale moonlight. On his side, 3 Crimson Talon warriors had fallen, and a dozen more bore wounds that Sect Master Hong's medics were hastily tending to. Jiang, the tactical leader, reported with a grim expression, her face smudged with dirt and blood. "We held them off, but they tested our lines. Their vanguard was probing for weaknesses, they'll be back at dawn with the full battalion." Li Wei's mind raced, the weight of the impending assault pressing down like a physical burden. He descended to the village square, where Kong Ming and Xiao Feng awaited, their faces etched with fatigue. Kong Ming had already sketched a rough map in the dirt, using sticks and stones to mark the terrain. The western pass narrows into Serpent's Gulch, a valley barely wide enough for 20 men abreast, he explained, his voice low and urgent. "If we can lure them there, the terrain will choke their numbers. But we must abandon our forward positions, sacrifice the outer watchtowers to make the retreat believable." Xiao Feng nodded, his eyes calculating. "I can rig the valley with alchemical traps from our remaining supplies, smoke powders to disorient, corrosive agents to weaken armor. But it'll drain our reserves for future defenses." Li Wei listened, his Dynasty architect's gaze flickering at the edges of his consciousness. He knew the cost, using it for tactical simulation would push him to the brink, but without it, the plan might fail. He closed his eyes, focusing on the mental strain as he visualized the valley. Images flashed, potential ambush points, false routes, the flow of enemy movements. A sharp headache pulsed behind his temples, but he saw it, the optimal placements for traps, the timing for retreats, the choke points where Kong Ming's archers could unleash hell. "Do it," Li Wei said, his voice hoarse from the mental exertion. "Kong Ming, prepare the false retreat, make it look like we're crumbling under pressure. Xiao Feng, set your traps along the gully's flanks. I'll coordinate with Sect Master Hong's warriors to hold the rear guard." The disciples sprang into action, their movements a blur of purpose. Li Wei stumbled slightly, steadying himself against a wooden post as the world spun. Yi Ling materialized from the shadows, her silent presence a comfort. "The enemy scouts are regrouping half a li west," she whispered. "They suspect a trap but are overconfident." General Zhao Ting leads from the front, eager for glory. As the night deepened, the village became a hive of frantic preparation. Villagers like Old Tan and Auntie May worked alongside sect members, reinforcing barricades and stockpiling arrows. Lin, with his surveyor's instinct, guided teams to obscure paths for the retreat. The air grew thick with tension, the scent of damp earth and fear mingling. Li Wei moved among them, his gaze assessing every detail, a loose stone here, a poorly concealed trap there. He adjusted placements with precise instructions, each decision drawing more from his dwindling mental reserves. By the time the first hints of dawn tinged the horizon, Serpent's Gulch was a death trap disguised as a natural passage. Kong Ming's forces staged their retreat as the Iron Fist Kingdom's battalion advanced, their drums echoing through the mountains. Warriors in dark armor poured into the valley, General Zhao Ting at their head, his confidence radiating like a beacon. He laughed, a harsh sound that carried on the wind. "See how they flee. The Azure Cloud Sect is nothing but rats in a hole." His battalion marched forward, unaware of the alchemical charges buried beneath the soil or the archers hidden on the cliffs above. Li Wei watched from a concealed vantage point, his heart pounding. The last of his disciples slipped into position, the trap set. As the first rays of sun broke over the peaks, casting long shadows across the gulch, the Iron Fist Kingdom's forces moved deeper into the narrow pass, their formation tightening. General Zhao Teng raised his sword, signaling the charge, his eyes fixed on the false retreat route ahead. The valley lay silent, waiting. Dawn's pale light seeped into Serpent's Gulch, casting long shadows that twisted like serpents across the rocky floor. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of anticipation. From his vantage point on a jagged outcrop halfway up the northern ridge, Li Wei watched as the Iron Fist Kingdom's battalion marched into the valley. General Zhao Ting rode at the head, his polished armor glinting dully, a confident sneer visible even from a distance. The rhythmic tramp of boots echoed off the narrow walls, a sound that seemed to vibrate through Li Wei's bones. He took a deep breath, feeling the strain already settling behind his eyes. Activating the Dynasty architect's gaze was like opening a floodgate of information, potential movements, weaknesses in the enemy formation, the shifting morale of his own forces. It painted the battlefield in overlays of shimmering light only he could see, blue for allies, red for threats, golden threads connecting actions to outcomes. But the cost was a persistent, gnawing headache that threatened to blur his vision. He pushed it aside, focusing on the first threads of the plan. Kong Ming stood lower on the slope, amidst a group of Azure Cloud disciples and Crimson Talon warriors. His voice, though not loud, carried a commanding clarity. Archers, hold until they pass the third marker. Disciples with short blades, prepare to strike from the eastern crevices on my signal. He glanced up, meeting Li Wei's gaze briefly, a silent acknowledgement that the trap was set. As the enemy vanguard reached the midpoint of the gulch, Xiao Feng gave a sharp nod from his position near a cluster of boulders. He gestured, and several disciples lit fuses on clay pots hidden among the rocks. With a series of muffled thumps, clouds of acrid, grayish smoke billowed forth, rolling down into the valley. The alchemical concoction was designed to irritate eyes and throats, disorienting without causing permanent harm, a tactic Li Wei had insisted on to avoid unnecessary slaughter. Cries of confusion rose from the Iron Fist ranks as formations wavered, soldiers coughing and stumbling. Now! Kong Ming's command cut through the chaos. Arrows hissed from hidden positions along the ridges, not aimed to kill but to pin and harass. Disciples emerged from crevices, striking at isolated groups before melting back into the terrain. Jiang, the Crimson Talon tactical leader, led a flanking maneuver from the southern ridge, her warriors moving with disciplined precision to harry the enemy's rear. The valley became a cacophony of clashing steel, shouted orders, and the eerie whistle of arrows. Li Wei's mind raced, the gaze updating in real time. He saw a contingent of elite guards forming around General Zhao Teng, pushing toward the narrowest part of the gulch, the choke point where the walls closed to barely 20 paces wide. Kong, redirect 3 archer teams to focus on that cluster, Li Wei muttered, though Kong Ming couldn't hear him. Instead, he signaled with a series of hand gestures they drilled beforehand. Kong Ming nodded, barking new orders. Meanwhile, Yi Ling's work unfolded silently. Earlier, she had infiltrated the enemy camp under cover of darkness, her shadow network architect potential allowing her to move like a ghost. Now, reports filtered in through whispered messages from villagers acting as runners, supply carts at the rear had their axles sabotaged, slowing reinforcements, a cache of medical herbs was contaminated with a mild toxin. These small acts of sabotage frayed the enemy's logistics, buying precious minutes. The battle intensified. Crimson Talon warriors clashed with Iron Fist soldiers in brutal melees, the clang of swords ringing sharply. One Azure Cloud disciple, a young man named Feng, fell to a spear thrust, his cry cut short. Li Wei flinched, the gaze flashing a warning of dropping morale in that sector. He focused, pushing a wave of reassurance through his own presence, standing firm, unflinching. Disciples rallied, fighting with renewed desperation. Xiao Feng coordinated from a sheltered alcove, directing disciples to ignite secondary smoke pots further down the valley, herding the enemy toward the choke point. His economic warfare genius translated into battlefield control, manipulating space and movement as if it were a market trend. "They're bunching up, Master Li," he called up, voice strained but clear. Li Wei nodded, sweat beading on his forehead. The continuous use of the gaze was taking its toll, his vision swam with afterimages, and a sharp pain lanced through his temples. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to analyze. The elite guards were breaking through, their discipline overcoming the chaos. General Zhao Teng led them, his aura a visible ripple of killing intent that seemed to darken the air around him. They carved a path toward the choke point, where Li Wei stood with a small guard of Crimson Talon warriors. Fall back to secondary positions. Kong Ming shouted, executing the false retreat they planned. Disciples and allies withdrew in controlled chaos, luring the general deeper into the trap. The valley narrowed further, walls looming like stone giants. Here, Kong Ming had placed the deadliest of Xiao Feng's alchemical traps, pits lined with caltrops and delayed ignition powders. As the elite guards advanced, the ground erupted in small explosions and clouds of choking dust. Soldiers screamed, falling into hidden pits or blinded by the debris. The Iron Fist advance stalled, but General Zhao Ting pressed on, his personal guard reduced to a dozen hardened veterans. They reached the choke point, where the path was littered with the bodies of fallen warriors from both sides. Li Wei stood his ground, the Crimson Talon guards forming a protective semicircle around him. His breath came in short gasps, the gaze flickering as his mental reserves neared exhaustion. He saw the general's approach in stark detail. The man's face was a mask of fury, eyes burning with the promise of vengeance. Behind him, the bulk of his battalion was entangled in the valley, but here, at this narrow passage, the fate of the Azure Cloud Sect would be decided. General Zhao Ting halted, his gaze locking onto Li Wei. The killing intent radiating from him was palpable, a cold pressure that made the air feel heavy. He raised his sword, its blade stained with blood and dirt. "Your tricks end here, upstart," he snarled, voice echoing off the stone walls. "Your sect dies with you." The valley seemed to hold its breath. Distant sounds of battle faded into a muffled backdrop. Li Wei met the general's eyes, his own vision blurring at the edges. He had no martial prowess to speak of, only his mind and the fading glow of the gaze. The general took a step forward, his elite guard spreading out to flank the position. Li Wei's hands tightened into fists, nails digging into his palms. This was the moment, the choke point, the climax of their multi-front defense. And he was out of time, out of options, with nothing left but the raw will to survive. The air in Serpent's Gulch tasted of blood and burnt herbs. Li Wei stood at the narrowest point of the valley, where jagged rock walls rose like broken teeth on either side. Before him, General Zhao Ting of the Iron Fist Kingdom filled the space, his armor scarred from the earlier fighting but his presence undiminished. The general stood a head taller than Li Wei, his shoulders broad beneath steel plates that gleamed dully in the morning light filtering through the smoke-hazed sky. "Your little tricks end here," Zhao Ting's voice rumbled like stones grinding together. He didn't shout, the words carried with the weight of absolute certainty. A sect master who hides behind traps and smoke has no right to call himself a martial artist. Li Wei felt the ache behind his eyes first, the lingering cost of using Dynasty architect's gaze throughout the battle. His muscles trembled with exhaustion, and the borrowed martial knowledge from his transmigration memories felt like a poorly fitting garment. He remembered basic stances, footwork patterns, defensive maneuvers, fragments of muscle memory from a body that had trained but never truly fought. "We're not here to prove martial honor," Li Wei said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "We're here to survive." Zhao Ting's laughter was a short, harsh bark. "Then you will die disappointed." The general moved without warning, a blur of steel and motion that seemed impossible for a man of his size. Li Wei's body reacted before his mind could process the attack, twisting sideways as a gauntlet fist whistled past his temple. The wind of its passage stung his cheek. He stumbled back, feet finding purchase on the uneven ground littered with fallen arrows and shattered alchemical vials. From the ridges above, Li Wei heard Kong Ming's shouted commands, "Archers, hold position. Don't waste arrows." And Xiao Feng's frantic movements as he prepared something from his dwindling supply of alchemical components. Yi Ling was somewhere in the shadows, but Li Wei knew his third disciple wouldn't intervene unless absolutely necessary. The espionage specialist understood the value of remaining hidden. Zhao Ting advanced again, this time with a series of controlled strikes that forced Li Wei into constant retreat. Each blow carried enough force to shatter stone, and Li Wei felt the vibrations through the ground as fists missed and struck the valley floor instead. Chips of rock flew like shrapnel. Li Wei dodged, parried with forearms already bruised from earlier impacts, and searched for patterns in the general's movements. He couldn't afford to wait. Closing his eyes for a heartbeat, Li Wei triggered Dynasty Architect's gaze. The world dissolved into lines of potential and weakness. Pain lanced through his skull, sharp, immediate, like hot needles driven behind his eyes. He saw Zhao Ting not as a man but as a system of martial principles, the way his weight shifted slightly to the right before a lunging attack, the micro-tremor in his left shoulder that indicated an over-reliance on that side for power generation, the predictable rhythm of his breathing that synced with three-strike combinations. But the cost was staggering. Blood trickled from Li Wei's nose, warm and metallic tasting. His vision swam, the analytical overlay flickering like a failing lantern. He had used the ability too much today, pushed it beyond safe limits, and now it threatened to consume what remained of his mental strength. Master. Kong Ming's voice cut through the haze of pain. Li Wei blinked, forcing the gaze to hold. The rockfall trap. 30 paces behind him, he shouted, the words tearing from a throat gone dry with exertion. Zhao Ting paused, confusion flashing across his battle-hardened features. Talking to ghosts now. The general lunged again, but this time Li Wei was ready. He didn't try to match strength against strength. Instead, he sidestepped at the last possible moment, letting Zhao Ting's momentum carry him forward. As the general's fist slammed into the rock wall where Li Wei had been standing, the sect master darted to the side, his foot hooking behind Zhao Ting's ankle in a basic tripping technique. It shouldn't have worked. Against a warrior of Zhao Ting's caliber, such a simple move should have been easily countered. But Li Wei had timed it perfectly, the moment when the general's weight was committed to the punch, when his balance was momentarily compromised. Zhao Ting stumbled, caught himself with one hand against the stone, and turned with a snarl of rage. You fight like a gutter rat, the general spat. Effective, though, Li Wei managed between gasping breaths. From above, Xiao Feng made his move. A glass sphere arced through the air, shattering at Zhao Ting's feet. Not smoke this time, but a viscous, amber-colored liquid that immediately began eating through the general's boots. Zhao Ting cursed, kicking at the substance, which only spread it further. Acid, the general roared. You dare use alchemical filth in honorable combat? There's nothing honorable about invading someone's home, Li Wei shot back, circling to keep the general's attention divided between the dissolving footwear and the immediate threat. He triggered Dynasty Architect's gaze again, and this time the pain was so intense he nearly blacked out. The world grayed at the edges, sounds becoming distant and muffled. But through the agony, he saw it, Zhao Ting's fighting style was built around overwhelming force delivered in linear patterns. The general had trained for battlefield dominance, for breaking shield walls and crushing armored opponents. He had no experience fighting someone who refused to stand and trade blows, someone who used terrain and deception instead of brute strength. Li Wei changed tactics completely. He stopped trying to create distance and instead closed in, staying inside Zhao Ting's optimal striking range. At this proximity, the general's powerful swings became awkward, requiring him to shorten his movements. Li Wei became a ghost, slipping past jabs, ducking under hooks, using the general's own bulk as cover from follow-up attacks. Stand and fight. Zhao Ting bellowed, frustration mounting. Kong Ming. Li Wei shouted, not taking his eyes off the general. The net. From the eastern ridge, a weighted net flew down, expertly aimed by Kong Ming's archers. It wasn't meant to trap Zhao Ting, the general sliced through the ropes with a sweep of his armored forearm, but it forced him to look up, to divide his attention for one critical second. In that moment, Li Wei struck. Not with martial power he didn't possess, but with precision. His fingers found a gap between Zhao Ting's chest plate and pauldron, where the leather straps had been weakened by earlier combat. He didn't punch, he pulled, yanking with all his remaining strength. The strap snapped, causing the pauldron to shift awkwardly, restricting the general's shoulder movement. Zhao Ting roared in genuine anger now, not theatrical rage but the fury of a warrior being systematically dismantled by inferior technique. He abandoned all pretense of form and charged, a battering ram of muscle and metal. Li Wei retreated, leading him step by step toward the prepared ground. He could feel the vibrations through his feet, the subtle instability of the terrain where Xiao Feng's alchemists had weakened the bedrock. Just a few more paces. Now, Xiao Feng. Li Wei shouted as he leaped backward. The ground beneath Zhao Ting's feet erupted. Not with explosion, but with collapse. A section of the valley floor, meticulously undermined over the past hours, gave way in a shower of dirt and stone. Zhao Ting dropped into a pit 6 feet deep, his armor clanging against the stone walls as he landed awkwardly. For the first time, Li Wei saw something other than contempt in the general's eyes, surprise, followed by dawning understanding. This hadn't been a series of lucky escapes. This had been a plan. You led me here, Zhao Ting said, the words quiet with realization. Li Wei stood at the pit's edge, breathing heavily. Blood still dripped from his nose, and his head pounded with a rhythm that matched his racing heart. Your battalion is broken. Your supply train is burning. Your scouts are dead or captured. You've lost. Zhao Teng looked up, and something changed in his expression. The anger didn't fade, but it transformed, becoming colder, more focused. You think this pit can hold me? The general placed both hands against the stone walls of his temporary prison. His muscles bunched, veins standing out on his neck and arms. The air around him seemed to thicken, to grow heavy with gathering energy. Li Wei had seen martial techniques before, the enhanced strength of cultivators, the speed of trained warriors, but this was different. This felt primal, like the earth itself was responding to Zhao Teng's will. My secret technique, the general whispered, though the words carried clearly in the sudden stillness. Forged in the volcanic fires of Mount Tianhua. Passed down through 7 generations of Zhao warriors. The ground began to tremble. Not just the pit, but the entire section of Serpent's Gulch. Small stones danced on the valley floor. Cracks appeared in the rock walls, spreading like spiderwebs. Master, get back. Kong Ming shouted from above, genuine alarm in his voice for the first time. Li Wei tried to move, but his body refused to obey. Exhaustion and the aftereffects of overusing Dynasty architect's gaze had locked his muscles. He could only watch as Zhao Teng slammed his fists together with a sound like thunder. The world shattered. Not metaphorically. Literally. The ground exploded upward in a wave of force that threw Li Wei backward. He hit the valley wall hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. Rocks the size of men's heads broke free from the cliffs and rained down. The entire central section of Serpent's Gulch, the narrow choke point where they'd been fighting, collapsed in on itself. Li Wei had a moment of perfect clarity as he fell. He saw Zhao Teng rising from the pit on a column of shattered earth, surrounded by a nimbus of crimson energy. He saw Kong Ming and Xiao Feng scrambling for safety on the ridges. He saw the ravine walls crumbling inward, creating a landslide of stone and dirt that would bury everything in its path. Then the ground opened beneath him, and he was falling into darkness. The last thing he saw before the world went black was Zhao Teng falling with him, the general's expression one of grim satisfaction even in defeat. They plunged together into the collapsing ravine, swallowed by the earth they had fought so hard to defend. The world collapsed into darkness and noise. Li Wei felt the ground give way beneath him, a violent shudder that tore through stone and soil alike. Dust choked his lungs, sharp fragments of rock pelted his body, and the roar of collapsing earth drowned out everything, General Zhao Teng's final roar, the distant shouts of his disciples, even the frantic beating of his own heart. He tumbled through the chaos, limbs flailing against debris, until impact drove the breath from his lungs. Then, silence. For a moment, there was only blackness and pressure, the weight of earth pinning him, the taste of grit and blood in his mouth. Pain bloomed in his skull, a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. He tried to move, but his body refused, muscles screaming in protest. His mind felt hollowed out, scraped raw. The Dynasty architect's gaze, that unique sense that had guided him through recruitment, strategy, and combat, was gone. Not just dormant, but absent, as if a vital organ had been torn from him. In its place was a void, and a headache so intense it made his vision swim with phantom lights. Voices pierced the muffled quiet, distant and distorted. Sect Master. Kong Ming's shout, edged with uncharacteristic panic. Dig here. The choke point collapsed. Scrabbling sounds followed, hands clawing at stone, the scrape of shovels, the grunt of effort. Li Wei forced his eyes open to slits. Dust motes danced in thin shafts of light filtering through cracks in the debris above. He lay half-buried under rubble, one arm trapped beneath a slab of rock. Nearby, he could make out the form of General Zhao Teng, similarly pinned but stirring with low groans. The general's ornate armor was dented, his face streaked with blood and dirt, but his eyes burned with undiminished fury even in defeat. Li Wei, Zhao Teng rasped, voice rough with dust and pain. You think, this changes anything? My king, will burn your sect to ashes. Li Wei didn't answer. Every thought felt like wading through mud. He focused on breathing, in, out, the simple rhythm a lifeline against the pain. The collapse had reshaped the valley floor, creating a jagged crater where the choke point once stood. Around them, the sounds of battle still echoed, distant clashes, shouts, the occasional explosion of Xiao Feng's alchemical agents, but here, in this pocket of ruin, there was only the two of them and the relentless digging from above. A hand broke through the debris, fingers scrabbling until they found Li Wei's shoulder. Got him. Xiao Feng's voice, tight with strain. Kong Ming, heave. Together, Kong Ming and Xiao Feng pulled, muscles straining against the weight of stone and soil. Li Wei felt himself being dragged upward, the rock shifting painfully against his trapped arm. With a final heave, they freed him, hauling him onto relatively stable ground. He collapsed, coughing dust, his body a tapestry of bruises and cuts. Kong Ming knelt beside him, face grimed with sweat and soot, his usual calm replaced by sharp urgency. "Sect Master, can you hear me?" Kong Ming's hands checked for serious injuries, his touch clinical but hurried. "The general?" Li Wei nodded weakly, gesturing toward the debris. "Alive. Trapped." Xiao Feng was already moving, sprinkling a powdered agent along the edges of the rubble. It hissed, weakening the stone, and with Kong Ming's help, they pried aside slabs to reveal Zhao Teng. The general struggled, but his injuries, a likely broken leg, deep gashes across his torso, left him vulnerable. Kong Ming bound his hands with rough cord, while Xiao Feng administered a sedative paste to a wound on his temple, ensuring he wouldn't rally too quickly. "The battle?" Li Wei managed to ask, his voice a dry croak. Kong Ming helped him sit up, supporting his weight. "Disorganized but ongoing. The collapse disrupted their center, but flanking elements are still fighting. Our forces are holding, but we need to press the advantage before they regroup." Li Wei tried to summon the Dynasty architect's gaze, to assess the battlefield, to find the optimal move. Nothing came. The void in his mind yawned wider, the headache spiking until he winced, pressing a hand to his temple. He was blind to talents, to potential, to the subtle threads of strategy he'd relied on since arriving in this world. For the first time, he felt truly helpless, a modern strategist stripped of his cheat, left with only raw intellect and the disciples he'd gathered. "You're in no state to command," Kong Ming said, not unkindly. "Let me handle this. Restore order, then we'll see to your recovery." Li Wei wanted to argue, but another wave of pain silenced him. He nodded, leaning back against a rock as Kong Ming stood, transforming from disciple to commander in an instant. His eyes scanned the valley, the smoke-choked air, the scattered clashes, the Crimson Talon fighters holding the ridges under Zhang's direction. He barked orders, his voice cutting through the din. "Xiao Feng. Use your remaining smoke agents to screen our northern flank, create confusion there. Yi Ling." He turned, spotting the third disciple emerging from the shadows, her clothes dusty but unharmed. "Take your spies and harry their retreat routes. Cut off any runners. Jiang. Coordinate with your warriors for a concentrated push from the east, drive them toward the gully's dead end." The disciples moved with practiced efficiency, no longer just students but parts of a war machine Li Wei had built. Xiao Feng scrambled up the slope, pulling vials from his belt. He mixed powders, creating billowing clouds of iridescent smoke that rolled across the northern section of the valley, obscuring vision and sending enemy soldiers coughing and stumbling. Within the haze, shapes moved, Crimson Talon fighters lunging from cover, their attacks sudden and brutal. Yi Ling melted back into the terrain, her small group of villagers turned spies following like ghosts. They targeted stragglers and messengers, using traps and ambushes to seal escape paths. One Iron Fist soldier, trying to flee with a signal banner, found a tripwire snapping taut, he fell, and a net dropped from above, entangling him until villagers secured him with ropes. On the eastern ridge, Jiang rallied her warriors. "With me. Push them down." She led a charge, swords gleaming in the dusty light, forcing a cluster of enemy troops backward into a narrowing part of the gully. The Iron Fist soldiers, already demoralized by the collapse and their general's capture, began to break. Some threw down weapons, hands raised in surrender. Others fought desperately, but without central command, their efforts were disjointed, easily countered by Kong Ming's coordinated strikes. Kong Ming himself moved through the battlefield, directing archers to pick off holdouts, signaling with flags to adjust positions. He seemed everywhere at once, a calm center in the chaos, his strategic mind weaving the disparate actions into a cohesive whole. Li Wei watched, pride cutting through his pain. This was what he'd seen with the Dynasty architect's gaze, not just a vagrant, but a conqueror in the making. And now, with that gaze gone, he could only witness it with ordinary eyes. The fighting dwindled over the next hour, fading into sporadic clashes and then uneasy quiet. The Iron Fist Kingdom's battalion was routed, those not captured or killed had fled into the wilderness, abandoning equipment and wounded comrades. The valley floor was littered with the detritus of battle, broken weapons, trampled banners, and the fallen on both sides. Azure Cloud disciples and Crimson Talon fighters moved among them, tending to injuries, securing prisoners, and collecting usable supplies. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and the sharp tang of Xiao Feng's alchemical residues. As the sun climbed toward midday, casting harsh light over the scarred landscape, Kong Ming returned to Li Wei's side. It's done. We've secured the field. Casualties are significant, but manageable. The general is under guard, sedated but stable. Li Wei tried to stand, using Kong Ming's arm for support. His legs trembled, and the headache persisted, a constant drumbeat behind his eyes. He surveyed their hard-won victory, the shattered valley, the weary but triumphant faces of his disciples and allies, the captured enemy soldiers sitting bound under watch. Pine Creek Village, visible in the distance beyond the gully, stood unharmed, its fields and homes safe, for now. They'd done it. They'd turned back a kingdom's army with unorthodox strategies and a band of misfits. But the cost was etched in every bruise, every fallen fighter, and the hollow absence where his unique ability once resided. He was about to speak, to offer some word of thanks or command for consolidation, when a movement caught his eye. From the southern pass, where the main road wound out of the valley, a single rider approached. The horse moved at a steady trot, its rider holding aloft a white banner, a flag of truce. He wore the colors of the Iron Fist Kingdom, but without armor, and his face was pale under the sun. The rider drew near, reining in a respectful distance away. He dismounted, hands raised to show he carried no weapon. In his grasp was a scroll, sealed with dark wax imprinted with a familiar emblem, the clenched fist of the Iron Fist King. The messenger's eyes scanned the battlefield, lingering on the captured general, before settling on Li Wei. His voice, when he spoke, was formal and cold, carrying across the sudden silence. Sect Master Li Wei of the Azure Cloud Sect. I bear a message from His Majesty, the King of the Iron Fist Kingdom. He extended the scroll. You are to release General Zhao Ting immediately and unconditionally. Should you refuse, or harm him further, the full might of the Iron Fist Kingdom will be unleashed upon you. Not a battalion, but the royal army itself. This is not a request. It is an ultimatum. Total war, if you defy the king's will. He placed the scroll on a flat rock, then stepped back, remounting his horse without another word. The clop of hooves faded as he retreated the way he'd come, leaving the sealed threat lying amidst the ruins of battle. Li Wei stared at it, the parchment seeming to pulse with ominous weight. Around him, his disciples exchanged glances. Kong Ming's jaw tightened, Xiao Feng's fingers twitched toward his vials, Yi Ling faded deeper into shadow. The victory they just bled for felt fragile suddenly, a brief respite before a storm of unimaginable scale. Li Wei reached for the scroll, his hand unsteady. The headache spiked again, a sharp reminder of his limitations. He had no dynasty architect's gaze to guide him now, no cheat to see a path through this. Only his wits, his disciples, and the terrible choice laid before him, surrender their hard-won prisoner and likely invite further demands, or refuse and risk annihilation. The valley held its breath, the dust settling over the dead and the living alike, as the weight of kings and kingdoms descended upon their ragged sect. The morning sun filtered through the makeshift command tent, casting long shadows across the maps and reports scattered on the rough wooden table. Li Wei sat propped against a stack of grain sacks, his head throbbing with a persistent, grinding pain that seemed to pulse behind his eyes. Every movement sent fresh waves of discomfort through his skull, a constant reminder of the cost of overusing the dynasty architect's gaze. He could still feel the phantom echoes of that battle, the way the world had fractured into patterns and probabilities, each decision branching into countless futures until his mind threatened to unravel at the seams. Now, the ability lay dormant, a locked door behind which his consciousness still rattled. He flexed his fingers, noting the tremor that hadn't been there before, and reached for the scroll that had arrived with dawn's first light. The parchment felt heavy in his hands, the wax seal of the Iron Fist Kingdom broken but still clinging to the edges like a stubborn scab. The messenger had been a lean, hard-eyed man in polished armor, his horse lathered from a hard ride through the night. He delivered the scroll without ceremony, his expression carefully neutral, then retreated to wait beyond the perimeter of the Azure Cloud Sect's temporary camp. Li Wei unrolled the document, the crisp rustle of paper unnaturally loud in the tense stillness. The characters marched across the page in precise, authoritative strokes, each line weighted with implied violence. By decree of His Majesty, King Wu of the Iron Fist Kingdom. The Azure Cloud Sect shall immediately release General Zhao Ting from unlawful captivity. All territory annexed from the Iron Fist Kingdom, including Pine Creek Village and surrounding farmlands, shall be surrendered. Compensation for damages inflicted upon our military forces shall be paid in full, 10,000 silver taels, or equivalent value in spirit stones. These terms must be met within 10 days of this message's receipt. Failure to comply will be met with the full might of the Iron Fist Kingdom's royal army. No quarter shall be given. No mercy shown. The signature at the bottom bore the king's personal seal, pressed deep into the paper with enough force to leave ridges on the reverse side. Li Wei read it twice, then a third time, his mind already working through the implications. 10 days. Not an immediate assault, but a deadline. A window. Outside, the camp stirred to life. He could hear Kong Ming's voice, crisp and commanding as he organized sentry rotations. The scent of medicinal herbs wafted through the tent flap, Xiao Feng brewing something for the wounded. Further off, the low murmur of Crimson Talon sect warriors discussing the previous day's battle, their tones mixing respect with lingering tension about their unexpected alliance. Li Wei pushed himself to his feet, the movement sending a fresh spike of pain through his temples. He steadied himself against the table, breathing slowly until the dizziness passed. The scroll remained in his other hand, its weight seeming to increase with each passing moment. He found the messenger waiting exactly where he'd been left, standing beside his horse at the edge of the camp's defensive perimeter. The man's armor gleamed in the morning light, too clean for someone who'd ridden through battle-scarred territory. His eyes tracked Li Wei's approach, noting the slight unsteadiness in his step, the pallor of his face. "You've read His Majesty's terms," the messenger said, his voice carefully neutral. "Do you have a response?" Li Wei studied him. The man stood with perfect military posture, his hands resting lightly on his belt, close to his weapons but not threatening. His expression gave nothing away, no anger, no impatience, just professional detachment. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes kept flicking toward the eastern road, as if measuring distance. 10 days is generous, Li Wei said, keeping his voice even. Your king could have demanded immediate compliance. His Majesty is a reasonable ruler, the messenger replied smoothly. He understands that, logistical considerations may require time. The words were perfectly chosen, perfectly delivered. Too perfect. Li Wei felt the first stirrings of the Dynasty architect's gaze, like a muscle that had been strained to tearing now being asked to flex again. He resisted the impulse, knowing the cost, but the need was too great. He needed to see. He focused on the messenger, letting his perception shift. The world didn't fracture into probabilities this time, the ability was too damaged for that, but something simpler emerged. A faint shimmer around the man's form, like heat haze over stone. Patterns of intent, not future possibilities. The messenger's professional detachment wasn't just discipline. It was calculation. The flick of his eyes toward the east wasn't impatience, it was timing. The cleanliness of his armor wasn't fastidiousness, it was preparation. He hadn't come from a battlefield, he'd come from a staging area. And beneath it all, woven through every gesture and word, was the unmistakable thread of deception. Li Wei's headache intensified, sharpening into a needlepoint of agony behind his right eye. He kept his expression neutral, though sweat beaded on his forehead. The king wasn't being generous. He wasn't being reasonable. He was buying time, time to regroup his scattered forces, time to bring fresh troops from garrisons further east, time to prepare a proper assault that wouldn't repeat General Zhao Ting's mistakes. The 10-day deadline wasn't an ultimatum. It was a countdown. Tell your king, Li Wei said, his voice steady despite the pain, that we will release General Zhao Ting. The messenger's eyes showed the first flicker of genuine emotion, satisfaction, quickly masked. Wise decision. And the territory? The compensation? In exchange, Li Wei continued, for formal recognition of our current holdings as sovereign Azure Cloud Sect territory. And a binding non-aggression pact, witnessed by neutral parties. For a moment, the messenger simply stared. The professional mask slipped entirely, revealing naked astonishment. You would bargain with His Majesty? After what you've done? We defended what was ours, Li Wei said. Your general attacked first. We have the prisoner to prove it. Release him, and this ends here. Refuse, and we keep him. And you can explain to your king how you returned without either his general or our surrender. He could see the calculations running behind the messenger's eyes. The man had expected capitulation, or defiance. Not this, a counteroffer that put the burden of refusal back on the king. A move that transformed a simple ultimatum into a negotiation. I cannot agree to such terms, the messenger said finally. My orders were to deliver the ultimatum and return with your response. Then take my response to your king, Li Wei said. The general for recognition and peace. Those are our terms. He turned and walked back toward the command tent, each step sending fresh jolts of pain through his skull. He didn't look back, but he could feel the messenger's gaze on him, weighing, assessing. The man mounted his horse without another word and rode east, back the way he'd come. Inside the tent, Li Wei sank onto a stool, pressing the heels of his hands against his temples. The after-effects of using the damaged gaze were worse than he'd anticipated, not just pain, but a hollow, drained feeling, as if part of his consciousness had been scraped away. Kong Ming entered a few minutes later, his armor still bearing the grime and blood of the previous day's fighting. The messenger left in a hurry, he observed, his sharp eyes noting Li Wei's condition. What did the scroll say? Li Wei handed it to him without speaking. Kong Ming read it quickly, his expression hardening with each line. 10 days. They want us to dismantle everything we've built and pay for the privilege. They want time, Li Wei corrected, his voice tight. The king's regrouping. The messenger was lying about their readiness. Kong Ming's eyes narrowed. You used the gaze. In your condition. I had to know. Li Wei took a slow breath, willing the pain to recede. We can't fight the full royal army. Not yet. Not with our casualties, not with the Crimson Talon sect already questioning how long they'll stay. So you offered a trade. Kong Ming wasn't asking. He'd already worked through the logic, his strategic mind racing ahead. The general for legitimacy. It's a good play. Forces them to acknowledge us as equals at the bargaining table, not rebels to be crushed. If they accept, Li Wei said. They'll accept talks, Kong Ming said with certainty. The king can't be seen refusing to negotiate for his own general's life. Not after Zhao Teng's failure. The court would tear itself apart. They spent the next hour planning, maps spread across the table, contingencies stacked upon contingencies. Xiao Feng joined them, his fingers stained with alchemical residues, his mind already working through the economic implications of formal recognition. Yi Ling slipped in silently, her presence barely disturbing the air, her shadow network already gathering whispers from the east. 2 days passed in tense preparation. The camp fortified its positions, scouts ranged further afield, and the wounded were moved to more secure locations. The Crimson Talon sect warriors, under Zhang's command, maintained their perimeter watch, but Li Wei could see the questions in their eyes. They'd signed on for a raid, not a prolonged siege against a kingdom. On the morning of the third day, the messenger returned. This time, he wasn't alone. A full escort of 20 Iron Fist Kingdom cavalry accompanied him, their banners snapping in the wind, their armor gleaming. They halted just outside arrow range, a display of force that was both threat and protocol. The messenger approached alone, another scroll in his hand. His Majesty has considered your proposal, he said, his tone carefully controlled. He agrees to negotiations for General Zhao Teng's release. Li Wei waited, saying nothing. The pause stretched, the messenger clearly expecting some reaction. The talks will be held at the Royal Palace in Iron Peak City, the messenger continued when no response came. 3 days hence. You may bring an escort of no more than 10. General Zhao Teng will be present at the negotiations, as proof of his well-being. He offered the scroll. Li Wei took it, breaking the seal. The language was formal, precise, outlining the terms of the meeting in exhaustive detail. Safe passage guaranteed under flags of truce. Neutral ground within the palace's negotiation hall. Witnesses from the Merchant Guild and 2 minor sects to ensure fairness. And at the bottom, the same royal seal, pressed with the same decisive force. Iron Peak City. The Iron Fist Kingdom's capital, nestled in the mountains a day's hard ride to the east. A fortress city, its walls carved from the living stone of the peaks themselves, its gates guarded by the kingdom's most elite troops. The heart of their enemy's power. His Majesty expects your answer by nightfall, the messenger said. Will you come to treat for peace? Or shall I tell him you prefer war? Li Wei looked past the messenger, to where his disciples waited. Kong Ming, his strategic mind already assessing the risks of entering enemy territory. Xiao Feng, calculating the value of a royal audience for future trade negotiations. Yi Ling, her shadow network doubtless already stretching tentative threads toward the capital. And beyond them, the camp they'd built from nothing. The villagers they'd protected. The territory they'd fought for. He thought of the Dynasty architect's gaze, still damaged, still painful to use. Of the exhaustion in his disciples' eyes. Of the Crimson Talon sect's wavering commitment. Of the king's army, regrouping somewhere to the east, its full strength still unknown. Tell your king, Li Wei said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, that we will come to Iron Peak City. The messenger nodded, a flicker of something, satisfaction, anticipation, in his eyes. 3 days. Do not be late. He turned and rode back to his escort, the cavalry wheeling in perfect unison to follow him east, toward the mountains. Li Wei watched them go, the scroll heavy in his hand, the king's seal seeming to burn against his palm. Kong Ming moved to stand beside him. It's a trap. He didn't phrase it as a question. Of course it's a trap, Li Wei said quietly. But sometimes, the only way out of a trap is to spring it yourself. He looked at the mountains on the horizon, where Iron Peak City waited. A fortress. A capital. A lion's den. And in 3 days, he would walk into it with his exhausted disciples at his side, to bargain for their future with a king who had already shown he preferred war to peace. The gates of Iron Peak City rose before them like the jaws of a stone beast, carved from dark granite that drank the morning light. Li Wei felt the weight of the Iron Fist Kingdom's capital pressing down on him before they'd even passed the threshold. His head still throbbed with the ghost of yesterday's migraine, a dull, persistent ache behind his eyes that flared whenever he tried to focus. The Dynasty architect's gaze felt like a cracked mirror in his mind, still functional but threatening to shatter completely with each use. Flanked by Kong Ming and Yi Ling, Li Wei passed under the archway. Kong Ming walked with the measured stride of a general surveying enemy territory, his eyes cataloging every guard position, every potential choke point in the wide main avenue. Yi Ling moved like a shadow given form, her presence so diminished that even the hostile glances of the city guard seemed to slide past her. She'd already vanished twice during their approach, returning with whispered observations about patrol patterns and the tension in the air. They're expecting us to run, Kong Ming murmured as they were escorted not to the royal palace, but to a secondary fortress complex within the city walls. The route avoids the merchant districts where we might find sympathizers. Li Wei nodded, his throat dry. The escort of 20 Iron Fist warriors in polished scale armor made no attempt to hide their hostility. Their captain, a man with a scar bisecting his lip, kept his hand resting on his sword hilt throughout the march. The streets of Iron Peak were cleaner than Li Wei expected, no beggars in sight, no stray merchants hawking wares. Every citizen they passed moved with purposeful efficiency, casting quick, wary glances at the Azure Cloud delegation before looking away. This was a city under military discipline, not just rule. They were led into a receiving hall that felt more like a war room than a place of diplomacy. Maps of the surrounding territories covered one wall, marked with troop movements and resource claims. At the center stood a heavy oak table, and behind it sat not the king, but 3 officials in elaborate robes of office. Li Wei recognized the setup immediately. This was a test, a deliberate show of disrespect by making them negotiate with subordinates first. The eldest official, a man with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held no warmth, gestured to the chairs opposite. Sect Master Li. I am Minister Gao, Overseer of Border Affairs. These are Minister Lu of the Treasury and Commander Wen of the Royal Guard. Li Wei took his seat, feeling the weight of Kong Ming's presence at his right shoulder and Yi Ling's unnerving stillness at his left. He forced himself to breathe evenly, to push past the headache that threatened to split his skull. The Dynasty architect's gaze stirred reluctantly in his mind, like a wounded animal rousing from sleep. We come under terms agreed upon with His Majesty, Li Wei began, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his gut. The release of General Zhao Teng in exchange for formal recognition of Azure Cloud territory and a non-aggression pact. Minister Gao's smile didn't reach his eyes. Terms can be refined. The king is occupied with matters of state. We are empowered to negotiate the particulars. Li Wei felt the first trickle of cold sweat down his back. He glanced at Kong Ming, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. They'd anticipated this, the king forcing them through layers of bureaucracy to wear them down, to make them desperate. As Minister Lu began listing what he called reasonable adjustments to the agreement, territory reductions, annual tributes of silver and rare herbs, restrictions on sect expansion, Li Wei let his gaze drift across the 3 officials. He focused past the pain, past the warning throb in his temples, and activated the Dynasty architect's gaze. The world sharpened and blurred at once. Colors bled at the edges of his vision, and details swam into focus with unnatural clarity. He saw Minister Gao's fingers tapping a specific rhythm on the table, a signal to someone watching from the gallery above. He saw the slight tremor in Commander Wen's right hand, the legacy of an old injury that made him favor his left side. And he saw the network of loyalties woven between them, invisible threads of obligation and debt. Minister Gao was the king's man through and through, but his eldest daughter had married into a merchant family that traded extensively with the Verdant Blade sect. A conflict of interest he hid beneath layers of bureaucratic efficiency. Minister Lu had embezzled from the royal treasury for years, covering his tracks with false ledgers, a secret known only to his personal scribe. Commander Wen owed his position not to merit, but to blackmail material he held over a now-dead rival. The information flooded Li Wei's mind in painful bursts. He clenched his teeth against the wave of nausea that followed, his vision swimming with afterimages. But he had what he needed. Minister Lu, Li Wei said, his voice cutting through the man's demands for increased tribute. Your accounting methods are creative. The discrepancy in last year's harvest taxes would interest the king's auditors, I imagine. The color drained from Minister Lu's face. He opened his mouth, closed it, then glanced at Minister Gao with barely concealed panic. Yi Ling chose that moment to lean forward and place a small, unmarked scroll on the table. She said nothing, but her eyes met Commander Wen's. The commander went very still, his injured hand curling into a fist beneath the table. Kong Ming spoke next, his voice carrying the weight of their victory at Serpent's Gulch. We defeated your finest general and his battalion with a fraction of your numbers. Imagine what we could accomplish as allies rather than enemies. The Verdant Blade sect grows bold along your northern border. We've intercepted 3 of their scouts in the past month alone. Minister Gao's composed mask cracked. You presume much, Sect Master Li. I presume nothing, Li Wei said, forcing himself to meet the minister's gaze despite the pounding in his head. I observe. Your kingdom faces threats on multiple fronts. We've proven we can defend what's ours. A formal treaty gives you a stabilized southern border and an ally who has already demonstrated military competence. Refuse, and you gain another enemy while your resources are stretched thin. The negotiations stretched through the afternoon. Each concession was dragged from the ministers like pulling teeth. Yi Ling's carefully placed revelations, whispered at key moments, documents produced from hidden pockets, kept them off balance. Kong Ming's strategic assessments of their military vulnerabilities, delivered with calm certainty, eroded their confidence. When the king finally appeared 2 hours later, it was with the air of a man doing them a great favor by his presence. King Feng was younger than Li Wei expected, perhaps 40, with sharp features and eyes that missed nothing. He wore armor beneath his royal robes, the edges of steel plates visible at his wrists and collar. You've persuaded my ministers, the king said without preamble, taking the seat Minister Gao hastily vacated. A remarkable feat given your circumstances. His gaze lingered on Li Wei, and for a terrifying moment, Li Wei wondered if the king could see the damage in his mind, the cracked foundation of his ability. We seek peace, your majesty, Li Wei said. But peace with recognition. King Feng studied the treaty draft his ministers had prepared under duress. The terms were far from ideal: heavy annual tributes, restrictions on martial demonstrations near the border, mandatory trade agreements favoring Iron Fist merchants. But it contained the crucial elements: formal recognition of Azure Cloud Sect's territory, including Pine Creek Village and the surrounding lands, and a 5-year non-aggression pact. Sign it, the king said finally, pushing the document forward. But know this, Sect Master Li. My kingdom does not forget insults. You have won a battle, not a war. The tribute you pay will remind you of your place. Li Wei took the proffered brush, his hand steady despite the tremor he felt in his bones. The ink flowed black and final on the parchment. King Feng added his own seal with a sharp, decisive motion. They were escorted from the city as the sun dipped toward the western mountains. The same hostile guards, the same silent streets. Only when they passed through the gates and began the descent toward the forest road did the tension in Li Wei's shoulders ease slightly. He walked in silence for a mile, the treaty scroll heavy in his inner robe pocket. The headache had receded to a manageable throb, but the Dynasty architect's gaze felt fragile, like a bone not yet healed. It was Yi Ling who broke the silence. She appeared beside him as if materializing from the twilight shadows, her voice barely audible. The king met with envoys from the Scarlet Mountain Kingdom and the Jade Valley Alliance yesterday. My people in the city overheard fragments, discussions of trade routes through what they now call disputed territories. Li Wei stopped walking. He's already planning to circumvent the treaty. Worse, Yi Ling whispered. Sect Master Hong of the Crimson Talon sect sent a message to the king this morning. Offering cooperative security arrangements along our shared border. And Bao the merchant has been complaining to anyone who will listen that our tribute requirements are cutting into his profits. He's talking to the Riverbend Merchant Guild about alternative suppliers. Kong Ming's expression darkened. We've won a breathing space, not safety. The king will use the tribute to weaken us economically while he builds alliances to strangle us territorially. Li Wei looked back at Iron Peak City, its walls glowing in the last red light of sunset. The treaty in his pocket felt suddenly insubstantial, a piece of parchment against the tide of ambition and resentment they'd stirred up. They'd secured their territory, but in doing so, they'd made themselves a target for every power that saw opportunity in their perceived weakness. We need to get back, Li Wei said, his voice tight. Before our new allies decide the spoils aren't coming fast enough. The forest swallowed them as night fell, but the weight of watching eyes followed them all the way home. The journey back to the Azure Cloud Sect's territory felt longer than the trek to Iron Peak City. Li Wei rode alongside Kong Ming and Yi Ling, the treaty scroll tucked securely in his saddlebag, its weight a mix of victory and foreboding. The rolling hills gave way to familiar landscapes, but as they crested the final ridge overlooking their domain, Li Wei reined in his horse, breath catching in his throat. Where once there had been ramshackle huts and crumbling walls, now stood a burgeoning settlement. Sturdy timber-and-earth fortifications snaked along the perimeter, reinforced with sharpened stakes and watchtowers that rose like sentinels against the sky. Smoke curled from chimneys in the village below, and fields of newly planted crops stretched toward the horizon, a patchwork of green and brown. The air hummed with activity, the clang of hammers, the shouts of workers, the rhythmic drills of disciples training not just in martial forms but in formations that mimicked battlefield logistics. Kong Ming, ever observant, noted Li Wei's silence. We did not idle in your absence, Master Li. Xiaofeng coordinated with Old Tan and the villagers to expand the fortifications, while I oversaw martial drills adapted for siege defense. Yi Ling's network kept us informed of any threats. Li Wei nodded, a faint smile touching his lips despite the persistent ache behind his eyes. The mental strain from overusing Dynasty architects' gaze had not fully abated, it lingered like a dull throb, a constant reminder of the cost of their survival. Yet, seeing this transformation, the chaotic ambition of his disciples channeled into tangible growth, stirred a flicker of pride. He nudged his horse forward, descending into the valley. As they entered the main gate, villagers paused to bow or wave, their faces etched with a newfound confidence. Old Tan was directing a group in reinforcing a section of wall, his hands gesturing with the precision of an engineer. Auntie May bustled about, organizing supplies with an efficiency that belied her age, while Lin surveyed the perimeter with a surveyor's keen eye. Xiaofeng emerged from a newly constructed workshop, sleeves rolled up and smudged with soot, a ledger tucked under his arm. Master Li. The trade routes are stabilized, and we've secured a surplus of grain. The merchant guild's enforcers haven't returned since our last negotiation. Li Wei dismounted, his legs stiff from the ride. The scent of pine and damp earth filled his nostrils, mingling with the distant aroma of baking bread. He walked slowly through the compound, taking in the details, training yards where disciples practiced not just swordplay but supply chain simulations, a makeshift council hall with maps pinned to walls, and even a small library stocked with scrolls on economics and diplomacy. It was no longer just a sect, it was a fledgling state, carved from desperation and cunning. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Li Wei gathered his disciples in the council hall. Torches flickered, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn table. Kong Ming stood with military poise, Xiaofeng leaned against a wall with calculated ease, and Yi Ling lingered in the corner, her presence almost imperceptible. Li Wei took a deep breath, the headache pulsing with each heartbeat. He knew what he had to do, one final, reckless use of Dynasty architects' gaze, to see not just individuals but the whole tapestry of their potential. Closing his eyes, he focused, pushing past the pain. The world dissolved into a shimmering overlay of light and shadow. Kong Ming blazed with a golden aura, his mind a fortress of strategic pathways, evolving from a vagrant's cunning to a conqueror's foresight. Xiaofeng glowed with a silver web of economic connections, his alchemical genius now woven into market manipulations and resource management. Yi Ling was a shadowy network of whispers and secrets, her espionage talents branching into a full intelligence apparatus. Around them, the villagers and lesser disciples flickered with smaller sparks, logistical aptitudes, diplomatic instincts, martial innovations. The holistic assessment washed over Li Wei, a torrent of insight that left him gasping, sweat beading on his brow. He collapsed into a chair, vision swimming, but the image was seared into his mind, his disciples were not just students, they were leaders in the making. We have survived, Li Wei began, voice raspy but firm. But survival is not enough. The Iron Fist Kingdom's treaty is a fragile piece, and Yi Ling's reports suggest the king plots with rivals. Our chaos has brought us this far, but now we must build something that lasts. He outlined a vision: structured expansion through alliances rather than annexation, internal discipline to curb reckless ambitions, sustainable growth focused on agriculture and trade. Kong Ming proposed a rotating militia system, Xiao Feng drafted economic policies to avoid market manipulation backlash, and Yi Ling suggested a spy network expansion to monitor neighboring kingdoms. The council lasted hours, plans crystallizing into actionable steps, the chaotic energy of the sects slowly funneling into a cohesive strategy. As dawn approached, they stepped outside, the first rays of sunlight glinting off the fortified walls. A sense of hard-won stability settled over the compound, palpable in the quiet hum of morning routines. Disciples began their drills, villagers tended to livestock, and the scent of cooking fires filled the air. Li Wei allowed himself a moment of respite, the headache receding to a manageable murmur. Then, a distant figure on horseback appeared at the gate, dust rising in its wake. The messenger dismounted, breathless, and bowed deeply. Master Li Wei of the Azure Cloud Sect. I bring word from the Supreme Martial Alliance. A grand tournament is to be held in 3 months at the Celestial Peak, the Continental Convergence. The rewards include legendary artifacts, vast territories, and recognition as a major power. All martial sects and kingdoms are invited, but the competition, it is said to include empires far beyond our region. He handed over a sealed scroll, emblazoned with the Alliance's sigil. Li Wei unrolled it, his eyes scanning the elaborate script. The tournament offered a chance to catapult them into the ranks of major powers, but the risks were staggering, facing opponents with centuries of cultivation and armies at their backs. He looked at his disciples. Kong Ming's eyes gleamed with strategic calculation, Xiao Feng's fingers twitched as if already counting costs, Yi Ling's expression remained unreadable but alert. The stability they had just forged hung in the balance, threatened by a promise too great to ignore.